Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Snoozy Scientist, where we wander gently through the mysteries of our world, one sleepy yawn at a time. Tonight, we're traveling back to a forgotten chapter of our own story, to an age when the world felt colder, wider, and far less lonely than it does today. Because for almost all of human history, we weren't alone. As recently as 40,000 years ago, the continent of Ice Age Europe was home to more than one kind of human. Not one people, but several, each shaped by the same cold winds, the same hunger, and the same fragile hope to endure. Back then, the word human meant something broader than it does today. It didn't describe a single species, but a family, a collection of beings who walked upright, built fires, and looked at the world through thinking eyes. Some had heavy brows and powerful limbs, built to endure the cold. Others were smaller, quicker, restless, drawn toward distant horizons. Different faces, different bodies, different voices, yet behind each there was the same quiet spark of thought and wonder. For over 350,000 years, long before modern humans ever arrived, the Neanderthals ruled Europe. They mastered the cold, built tools, and took care of their own. But they were not the only ones. There were others, shadows of kinship scattered across this frozen world. So, who were these other humans who shared our lands? What were their lives like, and why did their story end when ours continued? Tonight, we'll travel gently through that frozen world to meet the other humans of Ice Age Europe. But before we begin, if you're already enjoying this quiet journey together, it would mean so much if you gave this video a like or subscribe to the channel for more sleepy science stories. And if you'd like to share, I'd love to know, where in the world are you winding down from tonight, and what time is it there? It's always a joy to see how far across the globe this little corner of science drifts. So now, take a slow breath, let your shoulders soften, and together, let's return to the time when Europe wasn't ours alone. Long before our kind ever set foot upon it, Europe was a continent caught between warmth and ice. Its face changed slowly, yet endlessly, shaped by the rhythm of a restless planet. For hundreds of thousands of years, the land breathed in cycles, shifting from green and gentle to white and merciless. Forests rose and fell like tides, glaciers advanced and retreated, and rivers carved through the frozen earth, only to vanish beneath sheets of snow once more. There were seasons unlike any we know. When the air softened and the glaciers melted back, meadows unfurled across the valleys. The land filled with birch and pine, stretching toward the horizon in pale silver and deep green. Herds of giant deer wandered among the trees, their antlers like tangled branches reaching for the sky. Great woolly rhinoceroses brushed against the thawing earth, while wild horses pawed the damp soil in search of new shoots. The air was alive with the steady hum of insects and the cries of distant birds returning north, carried by the promise of warmth. But warmth was never more than a brief visitor. Inevitably, the cold crept back. Year after year, the sun's path shifted slightly, and the balance tipped. What had been streams turned to glass. The forests thinned, then disappeared beneath white plains. Snow gathered upon the mountains and slowly flowed outward, glacier by glacier, grinding stone to dust. Winds howled across the tundra, sweeping away the traces of the green world that came before. In those ages, Europe was not a single landscape, but many, layered and changing. Some winters lasted for tens of thousands of years. Ice walls towered above valleys, their faces scarred by the weight of time. Beneath them, silence ruled. In the distance, the seas withdrew, their waters locked away as ice. The coastline stretched far beyond where it lies today, exposing plains where mammoths and bison grazed on brittle grass. The mammoth herds were the beating heart of that frozen world. Their heavy feet pressed paths across the tundra, worn smooth by generations. Each one carried the memory of survival within its skin, thick and coarse, shielding it from the wind. Their tusks curved like crescents of ivory moonlight, tools for digging through snow in search of frozen roots. Around them followed wolves and hyenas, waiting patiently for weakness, for hunger, for the natural end of a life. To the north, the ice was endless. To the south, patches of refuge remained, where the cold softened just enough for forests to hold on. In those places, the cave lion reigned. It moved with quiet power through the shadows, its golden fur blending with the pale grass. Bears slumbered deep in caverns while the world outside froze. The air inside the caves was still and ancient, carrying the slow breath of survival. Each creature was shaped by the rhythm of this land. Thick fur, wide hooves, keen eyes that could pierce the mist. Those who lived here were sculpted by patience and endurance, molded by scarcity and cold. Nothing wasted energy, nothing was born without purpose. Even the plants seemed to move with caution, holding their strength in roots that reached deep into the frozen soil. The climate shifted endlessly. Scientists call these changes interglacials and ice advances, long waves in the ocean of Earth's history. Each wave carried new life, new migrations, and new extinctions. What we think of as ancient Europe was never still. It was a continent forever being rewritten. Sometimes warmth returned fully. The glaciers shrank into the mountains, leaving behind valleys rich with meltwater. Rivers burst forth, twisting through the open plains. Grasslands became jungles of green, and new animals crossed from the east. Straight-tusked elephants wandered where, not long before, there had been nothing but frost. Hippopotamuses bathed in slow rivers under skies thick with summer clouds. Even in the far north, flowers bloomed for a few brief centuries before the cold reclaimed them. And through it all, the earth turned silently. The continents shifted by inches, but the difference they made shaped the course of every life. Europe, caught between the Arctic and the warm winds from Africa, was a land of contrasts. It was a testing ground, a forge for life itself. Every creature that walked there, from the smallest vole to the mightiest mammoth, was part of an ongoing experiment in endurance. In those days, there were no cities or fires, no hands to shape the land with tools, yet the land itself was already preparing for their arrival. Valleys that would one day cradle villages were carved by glacial melt. Limestone caves, formed by dripping water and time, waited in quiet darkness. They would one day hold the echoes of laughter and language, but for now they kept only the sound of dripping stone and the distant groan of shifting ice. Each season left its mark upon the land, building a story in layers of earth and dust. If we could look down through time, we would see it written there, the pollen of vanished trees, the footprints of animals long extinct, the ripple of ancient rivers beneath fields of ice. Europe before us was not empty. It was full of motion and memory, a place already rich with lives, long before ours began, and in that silence, beneath the northern stars, the stage was set. The world was waiting for something new to arrive, something small, fragile, and curious enough to wonder at the cold, to build fires against the dark, and to name the world it found. But that moment had not yet come, for now the earth simply breathed, resting between the warmth and the ice, as the old continent prepared itself for its next kind of human. When the ice retreated once more, and Europe breathed a little easier, a new creature began to wander its valleys and forests. They were not like the mammoths or the lions or the deer that had come before. They walked upright, carried tools in their hands, and looked at the horizon with a kind of quiet intention. These were the first true humans of Europe, a species we now call Homo heidelbergensis. They arrived around 700,000 years ago, though time blurs gently that far back. To imagine them, you must picture a being, both familiar and strange. Their faces were strong, their brows heavy, their bodies broad and sturdy, built for a world that tested every muscle. They stood tall, nearly as tall as us, with minds that flickered with curiosity and problem solving. In them lived the first signs of a human spark, one that would one day branch into two paths, leading to both the Neanderthals and, eventually, to us. The land they entered was wild and shifting. Great forests of pine and oak covered much of southern Europe, while open plains stretched across the colder north. Herds of ancient horses and red deer grazed in the meadows. Rhinoceroses with thick skin lumbered near the rivers. And towering above all were the elephants, larger than any alive today, their tusks sweeping wide as they moved slowly through the grasslands. It was a continent rich with life, but also one that demanded skill, patience, and cooperation to survive. From the stones and bones they left behind, we can see how Homo heidelbergensis met that challenge. In a hillside at Atapuerca in northern Spain, archaeologists found their traces buried deep beneath layers of time. There, in the dim earth, lay tools shaped by deliberate hands, edges chipped in ways that speak of understanding rather than accident. Nearby, the remains of animals show cut marks on their bones, proof that these humans worked together to bring down large prey and divide the meat among their group. Across the sea in what is now England, another place tells their story. At Boxgrove, near the southern coast, workers uncovered bones more than 500,000 years old. Among them were tools of flint, sharp and elegant, and even the leg bone of one of these early humans. Its shape tells of strength and endurance, the kind of power needed to walk long distances and hunt across open plains. Beside it, scientists found the bones of a giant horse with clean, symmetrical cuts made by stone blades. It was a meal that required planning and teamwork, and it shows that these people were not scavengers following the leftovers of beasts. They were hunters, thinkers, and collaborators. Their tools were simple in form but precise in purpose, and they shaped stone flakes into hand axes, each one balanced and symmetrical, like the earliest expression of design. With these tools, they could butcher animals, scrape hides, and carve wood. In the cool air of the forests, they crafted spears from straight young trees, fire hardened at the tip to pierce thick hides. One such spear was found in Germany, preserved in ancient mud. It had been held, thrown, and perhaps reused many times, the mark of practiced skill. They did not yet paint or carve figures, nor do we find the ornaments that would later appear with Neanderthals and modern humans. But in their actions, in the way they shaped tools and shared food, we see the beginning of something deeper. They were starting to live as families and bands, bound by shared labor and quiet communication. The flicker of language might have been there in its simplest form, gestures and sounds passed around the firelight as they worked and planned together. Imagine one of their evenings. The sky darkens over a wide river plain. A small group gathers near a fire, its glow pushing back the night. They sit close, hands steadying wooden spears, the smell of cooked meat rising from the embers. Children drowse beside their mothers. In the distance, wolves call, and sparks drift upward like tiny stars. In that moment, there is already a kind of humanity, soft and fragile, that binds them together against the cold. The bones from Atapuerca reveal something else, too. Among them were the remains of many individuals placed together deep in a cave shaft. Whether by accident or design, it suggests a mind that could think beyond the moment, a mind that could acknowledge death. Perhaps they carried their dead away from camp, as if to separate life from stillness, though we cannot know their reasons. What we can sense is that they felt enough connection to stay close, to act as one. Over time, Homo heidelbergensis spread across much of Europe. They lived through shifting climates, through warm forests and bitter winters. Their kind adapted, changed, and branched. Some of their descendants would become the Neanderthals, shaped by ice and endurance. Others, farther south and east, would eventually give rise to the first modern humans. In this way, the story of Europe's people begins not with us, but with them. Their faces have long turned to dust, their footprints buried beneath countless layers of earth. Yet in every step we take across this continent, we follow in theirs. They were the first to face its cold winds and to find warmth in one another's company, the first to shape a piece of stone with thought and intention, the first to look across the land and see not just survival, but possibility. Before there were Neanderthals, before there were us, there were them, the first Europeans, carrying the light of thought into a world still half ice and half dream. The earth turned again, and the warmth that once brushed Europe began to fade. The forests thinned, the winds hardened, and the great animals moved southward in search of easier seasons. Across this shifting continent, the descendants of Homo heidelbergensis lingered, adapting little by little to the deepening cold. Over long ages, those changes became permanent. From them emerged a new kind of human, one sculpted by ice, endurance, and patience. We call them Neanderthals. Their story began around 400,000 years ago, though its roots stretch further back, hidden within the bones of Heidelbergensis. The split between our two bloodlines likely began 500,000 years earlier, when some groups moved deeper into the frozen north, while others remained closer to the warmth of Africa. Each branch followed its own path through time, carried by the same quiet drive to survive. In the north, the world was not gentle. Winters lasted most of the year. Ice sheets stretched across mountains, reflecting sunlight into endless white. The air was thin and dry, sharp enough to sting the skin. In such a world, survival was a kind of slow art, mastered over generations. The Neanderthals became experts in that art. Their bodies, their faces, and their minds were shaped by the climate that ruled them. They grew shorter and broader than their ancestors, their chests deep and their bones thick with muscle. Short limbs held heat close to the body, while wide hands and strong fingers helped them work with stone and wood, even in freezing air. Their faces were marked by heavy brows and large noses, an adaptation that helped warm the icy air before it reached their lungs. Behind those features lay eyes that saw the pale world in shades of gray and silver, watching the snow fall across familiar valleys. They lived through the slow pulse of the ice ages, enduring cycles of cold and warmth that rose and fell over hundreds of centuries. When the ice advanced, they moved south into the forests and caves of France, Spain, and the Balkans. When it retreated, they followed the reindeer and mammoth herds north again, reclaiming the tundra as it thawed. For more than 300,000 years, they adjusted to every rhythm of the planet, never leaving Europe, but always changing with it. To understand the Neanderthals, one must imagine not just their bodies, but the world that shaped them. The wind carried fine powder snow that settled on furs and hides. The sky often glowed with the faint green shimmer of northern lights. Herds of steppe bison moved like rivers of dark motion, their hooves pressing deep into the frozen soil. In the distance, the roar of lions echoed through the open plains, mixed with the low rumble of thunder that came from glaciers cracking far away. Amid all of this, the Neanderthals thrived. They were not simply enduring the cold, but mastering it. They hunted the great animals with precision, using crafted spears and carefully chosen stones. They built shelters from branches and hides, and made use of caves where fires glowed like small suns in the darkness. Each flame was a promise, a fragile defiance against the endless winter. The genetic record, hidden deep in bone and dust, tells us that the Neanderthals were already distinct from our own lineage long before we arrived in Europe. Their DNA had diverged from ours nearly 600,000 years ago, marking a fork in the human tree that would remain separate for most of history. Yet, even in that separation, the bond between our kinds was never fully lost. Our genomes still carry traces of their blood, reminders that our stories once intertwined. The resilience of the Neanderthals was remarkable. They lived through at least 10 major glacial cycles, surviving every freezing age that swept across the continent. When forests vanished beneath snow, they learned to track herds across open tundra. When the ice melted and rivers swelled, they adjusted again, following the new patterns of life. Their minds were tuned to the rhythm of change itself. We find their bones scattered across the land they called home. From the valleys of Germany to the mountains of Croatia, their fossils rest in silence, still shaped by the weight of time. Each skull, each fragment of bone, speaks of a life lived in deep connection with the earth. Scientists can see the signs of strength in the thick ridges of their skeletons, but also the marks of care. Broken bones had healed before death, meaning others must have helped them recover. They were not alone, not even in pain. Their world was one of long winters, but also of continuity. The Neanderthals passed on their skills through gesture and example, generation after generation. The way to chip stone, to track a herd, to keep fire alive through the night. Knowledge flowed quietly between them, unrecorded yet enduring. If one could stand among them and watch, the scene would not feel alien. A group gathered around a glowing hearth, smoke curling toward the cave's ceiling, the scent of roasted meat mixing with the cool air outside, children tracing shapes in the ash while elders mended tools beside them. In the flicker of firelight, their faces would seem almost familiar, their eyes reflecting thought and understanding. The birth of the Neanderthals was not a single moment, but a gradual becoming. Over millennia, they emerged from the shadow of their ancestors, each generation more suited to the world it inherited. They were the children of the cold, the caretakers of Europe through its harshest ages. Before us, it was they who carried the human story forward, quietly, patiently, beneath the weight of snow and time, and though the centuries would eventually take them, the shape of their lives endured, the strength of their limbs, the warmth of their fire, and the persistence of their will still echo faintly within us. They were not a prelude, nor a forgotten branch, but part of the same long breath of humanity shared across time. The world of the Neanderthals was harsh and beautiful, all at once. It was a landscape of shifting light and endless wind, a place where life was never simple, but always shared. Across the valleys and forests of Ice Age Europe, these people built their lives quietly, patiently, with the same steady rhythm as the turning seasons. Archaeologists have pieced together their story not from words or art, but from fragments left in the soil. A hearth of darkened stone, the mark of a flint flake, a bone with careful cuts. These are their sentences, written in earth instead of ink. And from these traces, we can see that the Neanderthals did not merely survive. They lived. Their days began beneath skies pale with frost or heavy with low clouds. Small groups moved together through the cold, wrapped in furs stitched from animal hides. The air smelled of pine resin and smoke from fires long tended through the night. They spoke in quiet tones, gestures flowing naturally between them, hands passing tools, food, or warmth. They hunted with skill and cooperation. Each hunt was a slow and dangerous effort that relied on trust. Neanderthals did not chase blindly across the plains. They studied the land and the behavior of the animals they depended on. In the snow, they read the language of tracks, the subtle bend of grass, the movement of birds. When they found their prey, bison, reindeer, perhaps a young mammoth, they worked together, encircling it with strategy and courage. The tools they carried were both practical and elegant in design. This tradition of craftsmanship, known today as the Mysterian, reveals their intelligence and care. Stones were shaped through precise blows, flakes struck at just the right angles to create sharp edges. Some were turned into scrapers to clean hides, others into spear tips that could pierce thick fur and bone. Each tool fit neatly into a hand that knew how to use it. These were not crude objects, they were thoughtful creations, passed down through memory and experience. Fire was the heart of their existence. Every known Neanderthal site holds evidence of it, circles of blackened stone, ash mixed with bone and charcoal. Fire was more than warmth. It was a constant companion, a light against the endless winter night. Around it, they cooked their meals, softening meat and making marrow easier to reach. They used smoke to preserve food for later days, and glowing embers to harden wooden spear tips in the quiet hours of dusk. The smell of burning wood was the scent of safety. Their shelters were simple but skillful. In caves, they built living spaces that shielded them from wind and snow. Some arranged stones in rings, perhaps as supports for hides stretched across them. Others used branches and mammoth bones to create sturdy walls. These homes were filled with evidence of care, scattered tools, sleeping areas arranged near the fire, bones of meals shared among many. The Neanderthals were not solitary. Their world was built on connection. Fossil evidence shows that they looked after their wounded and elderly. Broken bones that had fully healed tell us that those who could not hunt were not left behind. Someone must have brought them food, tended to their pain, and watched over them until they could stand again. In this way, compassion existed long before words to describe it. Food was shared, not hoarded. When a hunt succeeded, the meat was divided among the group, roasted over fire and eaten together. Bones were cracked open for marrow, and nothing was wasted. Children learned by watching, their small hands imitating the motions of their elders as they shaped stone flakes or tied sinew. Through repetition, skill became tradition, and tradition became memory. Evenings were moments of rest. Firelight flickered across stone walls, casting the shadows of those who gathered near. Some might have sharpened tools, others mended clothing or combed the fur of sleeping children. Outside, the cold pressed against the world, but inside, warmth and sound filled the dark. Perhaps they told stories, not in the words we know, but in tone, in gesture, in the shared rhythm of breath and laughter. The evidence of their settlements reveals no wasteful chaos. Everything seems placed with purpose. Hearths were rebuilt in the same spots for generations, suggesting an understanding of home, a place to return to rebuild, to remember. In a cave in Shanidar, far to the east, the bones of a Neanderthal man were found surrounded by traces of ancient pollen. Some scientists believe flowers had been placed around his resting body, perhaps by his companions. Whether or not it was intentional, the image remains gentle, a quiet moment that speaks of care beyond survival. Through all the centuries of ice and silence, the Neanderthals lived within a pattern of balance. They took what the land gave and gave back in turn through endurance. They were not the cold creatures of myth, but thinking, feeling beings who knew cooperation, protection, and belonging. If one could step into their world for a moment, to stand by a fire in a cave lit with orange light, to hear the murmur of voices rising softly over the crackle of burning wood, it would not feel alien, it would feel human, different in form perhaps, but not in spirit. For in their care for one another, in their craft, and in their quiet unity with the land, the Neanderthals lived the first long echo of what it truly means to be home. In the quiet depths of prehistory, long before our kind arrived, the Neanderthals were already thinking in ways that reached beyond survival. Their hands, so used to shaping tools and tending fires, also reached for color, pattern, and meaning. Beneath layers of earth and time, we have found the faintest traces of their thoughts, preserved in ochre stains, carved bones, and delicate fragments that speak softly of a deeper mind. For many years, people imagined them as creatures of brute strength, guided only by instinct. But the land itself tells a different story. In caves across Europe, pigments of red and black still cling to the walls, placed there long before modern humans ever arrived. These are not random smears. They were mixed carefully with powdered minerals and water or fat, then applied with fingers or brushes of moss. Some were arranged in shapes that repeat, dots and lines and hand stencils that appear again and again. It is as if, for the first time, a human mind began to whisper to the stone. In a dark cave in Spain, in a place called La Pasiega, a faint red ladder pattern stretches across the wall. Scientists have measured the age of the pigment, and the answer is astonishing. It is more than 60,000 years old, long before our species entered Europe. It must have been the work of Neanderthals. Near that same site, in other caves like Maltravieso and Ardalis, symbols of red and ochre appear alongside the imprints of hands, each finger spread open against the stone. They had placed a palm to the cave wall, then blown pigment over it, leaving behind a negative silhouette, a ghost of touch that still lingers tens of millennia later. These marks may not have been art as we understand it today, but they were something more than decoration. They were memory, identity, or ritual. Perhaps each symbol meant a place, a clan, or an event remembered in pigment rather than speech. Whatever their purpose, they reveal something profound, a mind aware of time, of meaning, of self. Elsewhere, traces of adornment have been found. At Neanderthal sites in Spain and France, perforated shells were discovered, their surfaces stained with mineral colors. Some held residues of black manganese or bright red ochre, as though they had been strung as necklaces or worn as ornaments. Others contained remnants of pigment inside, suggesting they had been used as small containers, a kind of ancient pallet carried from place to place. In one cave, eagle talons bore tiny cut marks, as if they had been detached and shaped for use as jewelry. It is not hard to imagine a Neanderthal woman or man wearing them, their meaning known only to those within the group. These clues reveal minds capable of choice and imagination. The Neanderthals did not only see the world as it was, they shaped it into what it could be. Their creativity was quiet, perhaps practical, but it carried the same spark of curiosity that later filled the caves of Lascaux and Chauvet with painted herds. What about their voices? That question lingers softly between the stones. Were they able to speak, to share stories, to name what they saw? Their bones offer hints. Inside the throat of one Neanderthal skeleton, found in a cave at Kebara in Israel, lies a small horseshoe-shaped bone called the hyoid. Its form matches ours almost exactly, the anchor that supports the muscles of the tongue and larynx. This suggests that their speech apparatus was capable of producing complex sounds. Genetic evidence deepens the mystery. In Neanderthal DNA, scientists have identified the same gene that shapes language in us today, known as FOXP2. It is a small clue, but one that points toward the possibility of structured communication. Perhaps their speech was slower, with simpler sounds, but it may have been enough to name things, to call to one another, to tell someone to wait or to run. Language, in any form, would have changed how they shared knowledge, how they planned hunts, and how they passed down what they had learned. Their thoughts, though foreign to us, were not simple. They recognized beauty, even if they did not name it so. They showed empathy, as seen in their care for the injured and the old. They understood permanence, leaving marks and ornaments that lasted far beyond their lifetimes. Their intelligence was tuned to their world, a world of stone and wind and fire, where imagination might bloom in the flicker of a torch upon a cave wall. To look at a piece of ochre, crushed in a Neanderthal hand, is to glimpse the earliest spark of our shared mind. It is proof that meaning did not arrive with us. It was already there, growing quietly in the minds of those who watched the same stars, walked the same valleys, and saw in color what others only saw in light. Their world was not primitive, it was different, built for endurance, shaped by cold, and guided by intuition as much as thought. The Neanderthals lived within the rhythms of nature, close enough to understand its moods, close enough to see pattern and wonder in every mountain and flame. And within that closeness, they began to dream, not of the future, not of invention, but simply of being. The first stirrings of art, of symbol, of voice, all began in their quiet minds, echoing softly through time, until at last those echoes reached us. By the time the Neanderthals had already weathered hundreds of winters in Europe, a new kind of traveler was stirring far to the south. Beneath the vast skies of Africa, where grasslands shimmered with heat and the air carried the scent of rain, another branch of the human story was quietly preparing to move. They were Homo sapiens, our direct ancestors, and their journey would carry them farther than any species before them. For hundreds of thousands of years, Africa had been their home. It shaped their minds, their hands, and their sense of the world. There, they learned to read the signs of nature, the tracks of gazelles in dry riverbeds, the rhythm of the seasons, the way the stars curved across the night. Around them grew the beginnings of what we might call imagination. They painted their shelters with earth-colored pigments, carved beads from bone and shell, and began to shape not just tools, but symbols. Then the earth began to change. The climate shifted once again, and with it came new opportunities. Rivers carved through open plains, corridors of life, stretching northward into the unknown. Somewhere around 45,000 years ago, small groups of Homo sapiens began to follow these paths out of Africa. They carried little with them except fire, language, and curiosity, the greatest tools any traveler could possess. The first migrations were small, almost invisible on the scale of continents. Families and bands of a few dozen people crossed narrow straits and open valleys, moving through the Middle East, where forests and grasslands met. There, they would have seen familiar animals, gazelles, ostriches, lions, and unfamiliar ones as well, creatures adapted to cooler, wetter climates. Some moved through what is now the Sinai Peninsula, others across the land bridge that once connected Africa to Arabia. In time, their paths diverged again. One group pressed northward through the Levant, following rivers that led them into the heart of Anatolia, the land that would one day become Turkey. The journey was not a single wave, but a slow and patient drift, each generation moving just a little farther than the one before. By the time these early humans reached Europe, the land before them was a mixture of beauty and challenge. Ice still lingered across much of the north, carving mountains and shaping the wind. Mammoths and reindeer roamed the open plains. Herds of bison thundered across frozen ground. To survive here required resilience and cooperation. But the new arrivals carried something that would give them an edge: creativity. They came with tools unlike any that had been seen before. Long, slender blades of stone replaced the heavier hand axes of earlier species. Bone and antler became raw materials for needles, harpoons, and ornaments. They fashioned spear points that could be replaced when broken, showing an understanding of design and efficiency. These innovations formed what archaeologists now call the Upper Paleolithic revolution, a quiet transformation of mind as much as of matter. Their art was more than decoration. In small shelters and deep caves, they painted scenes of animals and human life. Horses with flowing manes, bison drawn in powerful curves, handprints pressed onto stone. Some figures were carved from ivory or soft stone, their shapes abstract yet alive. These early works spoke of memory, of storytelling, and perhaps of belief, the ability to see the world not only as it was, but as it could be imagined. Genetic evidence suggests that only a few thousand individuals made this journey into Europe, a tiny fraction of the human population. Yet from that small beginning came all the diversity of life that followed. Every modern European today carries traces of those early travelers in their DNA. They were not an invasion, but a quiet arrival, spreading slowly through a continent that had already been home to others for hundreds of millennia. Wherever they went, they left behind signs of adaptability. In the caves of southern France, fragments of ochre and bone show the mixing of pigments for painting. In Italy and Moravia, jewelry made from animal teeth and shells reveals an appreciation for beauty. Along the Danube River, they built temporary camps, their hearths arranged in circles that mirrored the shape of communities to come. It is easy to think of them as wanderers, but they were more than that. They were bridge builders, connecting worlds that had long been separate. As they moved into Europe, they encountered the Neanderthals, not as myths, but as living people. Their meeting would reshape both species forever. For now, though, the newcomers were learning the rhythms of this colder world, listening to the language of its winds, its rivers, its silence. The arrival of Homo sapiens was not marked by conquest, but by quiet persistence. They brought with them an expanding imagination, a growing sense of self, and the spark of symbolic thought that had begun so long ago in Africa. Where the Neanderthals had endured through endurance, these newcomers survived through innovation, through their ability to imagine what did not yet exist. Under the same stars that the Neanderthals once watched, the first modern humans lit their fires on European soil. Smoke curled into the night as they spoke softly to one another, sharing warmth and stories, unaware that they were beginning a new chapter in the long human story. They were not just entering a land of ice and shadow, they were entering the story of us, and with them came the first breath of a world that would never be the same again. For many ages, the Neanderthals had been the quiet rulers of Europe. They had known its forests and rivers better than any creature alive, following the slow rhythms of ice and thaw through countless generations. Then, one distant day, footsteps began to echo across the same valleys that had always been theirs. The sound was familiar, yet slightly different, lighter, faster, carrying a different rhythm of breath. When Homo sapiens first entered Ice Age Europe, they stepped into a land already filled with history. Every ridge, every cave, every stretch of tundra carried the memory of lives that had come before. The air was cold, the horizon pale, and in the stillness between snowfalls, two human worlds began to draw near. For thousands of years, they would live side by side. The newcomers came in small groups, families and bands no larger than a few dozen, their numbers tiny against the immensity of the land. The Neanderthals, already scattered and few, moved through familiar territories, unaware at first that their story was about to entwine with another. No one knows exactly how the first meeting happened. Perhaps it took place beside a river, where both groups came to drink. Perhaps it was on a hunt, when the movement of prey revealed another band of hunters in the mist. Or perhaps it was inside a cave, the flicker of firelight revealing faces that were almost, but not quite, the same. The moment must have carried a strange recognition. Both species stood upright, both carried tools, both tended fires, both watched the world with intelligent eyes. But there were differences too, subtle and unmistakable. The Neanderthals were broader, their arms stronger, their faces marked by long noses and heavy brows. The newcomers were slighter, more delicate in form, with high foreheads and rounded skulls. They looked upon each other with caution, perhaps curiosity, perhaps something deeper, the awareness of seeing another self reflected, yet altered. The two kinds of humans shared the land for millennia. Evidence suggests that they crossed paths often, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. There were times of competition for hunting grounds and shelter, but also times of quiet coexistence. In the caves of France and Italy, archaeologists have found layers of tools belonging first to Neanderthals, then to modern humans, sometimes even mixed together. It seems that for a long while, Europe was a shared continent, and in that overlap, something remarkable happened. The two species met not only in space, but in blood. From the bones of both kinds of humans, scientists have drawn out the microscopic threads of DNA, the molecular record of life. What they found is astonishing. Every person alive today who descends from non-African ancestry carries within them a small portion of Neanderthal DNA, roughly 1 to 2%. This means that somewhere in the deep past, these two worlds did not only meet, they mingled, they spoke, they traveled together, and they shared children who carried the combined legacy of both. The evidence tells of multiple moments of connection scattered across time and place. In some regions, genetic traces suggest repeated contact, enough to weave their stories together again and again. These were not fleeting encounters between strangers. They were relationships between people, hunters, families, and lovers, bound by the same basic human needs for warmth, safety, and belonging. It is easy, from a distance of 40,000 years, to imagine the meeting of these species as something dramatic or fearful. But the truth was more human and more gentle. They were not beasts meeting humans, but equals meeting equals. Both had language, both had art, both had the quiet fire of thought. Imagine a small clearing in the middle of winter. A Neanderthal woman crouches near a fire, feeding it with dry branches. The snow reflects the orange light, and shadows dance across her face. From the edge of the trees, a figure appears, a stranger with features softer, unfamiliar. She watches him approach, and he stops a few paces away. For a moment, the world holds its breath. Then, perhaps, she gestures toward the fire. The stranger steps forward, and the distance between two worlds begins to close. The genetic story, written in our cells, remembers that moment. The shape of our immune systems, the way our skin responds to sunlight, even how our bodies react to certain temperatures, all carry faint echoes of Neanderthal ancestry. It is as if their presence never truly vanished, only folded quietly into our own. For thousands of years after that first meeting, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens shared Europe's cold plains and forests. There were times when their lives intertwined closely, and times when they drifted apart again. The land was vast enough for both, at least for a while. Camps of each kind dotted the same valleys, separated perhaps by days of travel, but joined by the same rivers, the same migrating herds, and the same starlit sky. In the end, it was not conflict that defined them, but connection. Their interactions left behind no written record, no songs or stories that survived, but their legacy endures in every one of us. The meeting of these two species was one of the most intimate and profound events in Earth's history, a reunion of minds that had grown apart but never lost the same spark. And so, beneath the cold stars of Ice Age Europe, the first humans met the first humans, two branches of the same ancient tree, reaching toward each other across time, sharing warmth, and unknowingly ensuring that neither would ever be forgotten. Far beneath the frozen soil of Siberia, In a cave where the walls still echo with the slow drip of melting ice, scientists once uncovered a tiny fragment of bone. It was small enough to be mistaken for nothing at all, a splinter of ivory colored dust buried in darkness for tens of thousands of years. But inside that fragile piece of bone lay one of the most extraordinary stories ever written into DNA, the story of a child whose parents did not belong to the same species. This fragment came from a place known as Denisova Cave, hidden in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. It was a place both ancient and silent, once shared by Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans at different times. When researchers carefully examined the fragment, they discovered that it belonged to a young girl who had lived around 90,000 years ago. She had died before reaching adulthood, yet in her short life, she had carried within her body the meeting of two great human lineages. Her mother was a Neanderthal, strong and broad, likely from the cold forests of Europe. Her father was a Denisovan, part of a population that had lived farther east, closer to the rising mountains and deep valleys of Asia. The girl was a hybrid, the first known child of two different kinds of human. Her existence alone changed what we thought we knew. It meant that the boundaries between these species were never solid walls, but soft edges where lives intertwined. The two groups must have met, not as enemies, but close enough to build families, to share shelter, to share firelight. From that single bone, scientists could read an entire ancestry. The girl's DNA revealed that her father himself carried traces of Neanderthal heritage, proof that their stories had crossed more than once. This was not an isolated event, it was part of a quiet pattern, repeated again and again as our ancient cousins met across mountains, plains, and generations. The cave where she was found still bears the marks of their overlapping lives. Layers of soil hold stone tools made in different styles, showing that Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans passed through the same entrance over tens of thousands of years. Perhaps they never knew each other all at once, but their presence shared the same walls, the same air. Thousands of kilometers away, another discovery offered an even closer connection to us. In a limestone cave in Romania, deep in the Carpathian Mountains, a partial human skull was found. It belonged to a modern human who had lived around 40,000 years ago, one of the earliest of our kind to enter Europe. The skeleton became known as Oase 1, named after the cave in which it rested, Pestera Q Oase, the cave with bones. When geneticists studied the DNA within that ancient skull, they found something astonishing. The man carried a Neanderthal ancestor only 4 to 6 generations back. That means that his great-great-grandparent, or perhaps great-great-great-grandparent, was a Neanderthal. It was not a distant trace lost in deep time. It was recent, personal, part of his family story. He was modern human by species, but his features would have carried whispers of two worlds. Maybe his face bore the soft contours of Homo sapiens and the subtle strength of Neanderthal bone. He was living proof that the meeting between these peoples was not just theoretical, it was lived, felt, and passed on through generations. Across Eurasia, the evidence continues to speak in fragments. A tooth here, a bone there, bits of DNA preserved in ancient soil. They tell of a network of contact that stretched across continents. It was not a meeting of opposites, but a blending of similarities. Neanderthals and modern humans shared nearly identical brains, used fire, cared for the wounded, and built tools with intention. The Denisovans, though known only through genetic traces and a handful of bones, seem to have shared the same capacity for endurance and creation. These hybrids, these children of mixed ancestry, are not symbols of confusion, but of connection. They remind us that evolution is not a ladder, but a web. Life overlaps and entwines, never cleanly separated. The world of the Ice Age was filled with boundaries that blurred, shaped by migration, curiosity, and need. Somewhere, perhaps, Neanderthal families and modern human wanderers sat together at night beside the same fires, speaking in patterns of sound that both could understand. Perhaps they traded food or tools, or simply watched their children play in the snow, unaware that those children would carry forward a shared future. The story written in our DNA carries echoes of those quiet encounters. Every person alive today outside of Africa holds a small inheritance from the Neanderthals, and in some regions of Asia, from the Denisovans as well. The genes they gave us touch everything from our immune systems to how our bodies adapt to cold or high altitude. Their legacy lives not as a separate lineage, but as part of what we are. When we speak of the hybrid children, we are not speaking of rare accidents in prehistory. We are speaking of moments when humanity itself widened its borders, of times when different faces met across the cold valleys of an ancient earth and recognized, perhaps wordlessly, that they were not so different after all. The girl from Denisova Cave and the man from Romania are gone, their voices silent for 90,000 years. Yet their bloodlines never truly vanished. They flow quietly in ours, a living reminder that the human story was never just one story at all. It was many, meeting, mixing, and continuing together beneath the same sky. When words are lost to time, it is the objects left behind that speak for us. Long after voices fade and bones crumble, the stones, the points, and the fragments of human hands remain. Across Ice Age Europe, these silent artifacts lie buried beneath the soil, each one carrying the shape of a mind at work. Through them, we can still trace the quiet dialogue between two kinds of people, the Neanderthals and the modern humans who shared their world. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals shaped stone with a precision born of patience. Their tools were strong and reliable, crafted from flint and quartzite, chipped into symmetrical flakes. This tradition, known today as the Mousterian, was the heartbeat of their culture. They struck stones with practiced rhythm, producing scrapers for hides, knives for butchering, and points for spears. Each piece was shaped not by accident, but by design, an understanding of how a rock could become an edge, and how an edge could become a rock, life-saving tool. To hold one of these tools today is to feel the calm certainty of repetition. The edges are smooth from use, the surfaces worn from thousands of fingers. They speak of hunters who knew the land, who could turn a raw stone into a companion of survival. Yet when Homo sapiens began to enter the same landscapes, new shapes appeared in the earth. Their tools were lighter, more varied, and more experimental, carved with a sense of curiosity that pushed beyond tradition. Modern humans brought with them what scientists now call the Aurignacian culture, a new wave of innovation that transformed stone into art as much as instrument. Their blades were long and thin, struck from carefully prepared cores that yielded sharp, uniform slices. They carved bone and antler into points, needles, and ornaments, shaping not only weapons but symbols. A spear could now be tipped with ivory, polished, smooth, and bound with sinew and resin. It was a step beyond the practical, a union of function and imagination. Between these two worlds, the steadfast craftsmanship of the Neanderthals and the experimental artistry of the newcomers, there lies a mystery. In a few caves of France and Spain, archaeologists have uncovered tools that seem to bridge both traditions. They belong to what is now called the Châtelperronian culture, named after a small village in central France where the first of these artifacts were found. At first glance, the tools seem distinctly modern: fine blades, bone points, and even fragments of jewelry made from animal teeth and shells. Yet when scientists looked closer, they found that these layers were occupied not by modern humans, but by Neanderthals. This discovery startled the world of archaeology. It meant that the Neanderthals may have learned, adapted, or even reinvented techniques that mirrored the innovations of Homo sapiens. Whether this was the result of imitation, trade, or shared insight, no one can say for certain. But what it reveals is clear. The Neanderthals were not static. They were watching, learning, and creating. They were part of a living exchange of ideas that crossed the boundaries of species. The Chattelperonian culture stands as quiet proof that knowledge is contagious, that innovation can flow in more than one direction. Composite tools, weapons, and implements made from several materials combined became the hallmark of this blending of minds. A spear point carved from flint might be set into a shaft of ash, bound with strips of tendon and sealed with resin drawn from pine trees. The connection between materials mirrored the connection between thoughts, each layer reinforcing the next. Through such craftsmanship, early humans turned nature itself into a partnership. In their hands, even the smallest fragments became meaningful. A broken blade could be reshaped into a scraper. A discarded antler could be filed into a new point. This adaptability showed something new in the human mind, not only the ability to solve problems, but to imagine solutions before they were needed. The making of tools was more than survival. It was an act of thinking, a dance between mind and matter. Every strike of stone against stone carried memory, passed down through generations. The shape of a spearhead, the balance of a handle, the pattern of flaking, all were learned by watching, practicing, and teaching. Through this quiet education, the first engineers of the Ice Age passed on more than technique. They passed on the beginnings of tradition. To watch one of them at work, if we could, would feel strangely familiar. A Neanderthal sitting by a fire, turning a stone in his palm, studying its edges. A modern human nearby, testing the sharpness of a bone point, holding it up to the light. Two figures divided by lineage, but united by purpose. The crack of stone, the hiss of fire, the slow hum of thought. These sounds would have filled the same air. From these tools, we learn that intelligence does not belong to one kind of human. It is a shared inheritance, born from the same need to understand and shape the world. Whether struck from flint or carved from bone, each artifact is a fragment of communication, a message left for those who would one day uncover it. In the end, it is through their tools that the Neanderthals and early modern humans still speak to us. They tell of minds that could plan, adapt, and dream. They tell of hands that worked not only for the present, but for a future they would never see. And when we look at those stones today, their edges still sharp after tens of thousands of years, it feels as though we are touching the very thoughts that made us human, the patient rhythm of creation, the quiet intelligence of survival, and the enduring beauty of minds that shaped the world from simple earth and light. Before words shaped our world, there were gestures, glances, and the rhythm of shared breath beside the fire. Long before writing, before sound carried meaning across distance, communication began with movement, a hand raised in warning, a nod of trust, a spark of understanding caught in another's eyes. Across Ice Age Europe, in caves and valleys where the wind whispered through stone, early humans spoke in ways that did not always need a voice. The Neanderthals, with their strong hands and keen eyes, lived in close circles where gestures must have been as vital as food or flame. In a world where survival depended on cooperation, every movement mattered. A flick of the wrist could signal a change in direction during a hunt. A glance could hold the difference between fear and safety. Even silence carried weight, the shared quiet of watching the fire, the unspoken understanding between those who knew the cold and had learned to endure it together. Around the hearth, communication deepened. Firelight revealed faces, softened by the glow of orange and gold. Shadows danced on cave walls, as families worked, cooked, and rested. Words, if they existed, were likely few but meaningful, sounds shaped by breath and intent. Around those flickering flames, the first human conversations may have been born. The language of fire was universal. It spoke through crackle and warmth, through the slow rising of smoke that signaled safety or presence from afar. To keep the fire alive was to keep life itself, and around that same circle of warmth, hands began to move with purpose, telling stories without sound. A hunter describing a chase might gesture with swift motions, tracing the path of the prey in the air. A mother might hum softly while showing her child how to grind pigment, her movements slow and deliberate. The cave walls around them became their earliest pages. In the same way that they shaped tools and adorned themselves with color, these early humans also learned to leave signs, not of ownership, but of memory. Fingers pressed into soft clay, charcoal lines marking shapes, hands outlined in pigment. These were not just decorations, but conversations left for those who would come later. Through these symbols, meaning stretched beyond the moment. Scientists studying the bones of the Neanderthals have found hints that their voices, too, carried far more than once imagined. Deep in the throat, a small horseshoe-shaped bone known as the hyoid was discovered, almost identical in shape and position to our own. It anchors the muscles of speech, supporting the movement of the tongue and the control of sound. This tiny piece of anatomy suggests that Neanderthals were capable of producing a wide range of vocal tones, the building blocks of language. Their ability to speak may have been limited compared to ours, but it was likely far from silence. They could have shared simple words, perhaps names for things they hunted, tools they used, or places they traveled. A vocabulary of essentials, water, fire, friend, danger, may have bridged the distance between thought and expression. And when the first modern humans arrived in Europe, carrying their own developing tongues, it is possible that both species understood fragments of each other's sound. The making of tools and the making of words were likely born together. To shape a stone into a blade required planning, precision, and the understanding of sequence, the same mental skills needed to form a sentence. Each strike of stone against stone carried a rhythm, a memory of pattern. The mind that could imagine a tool before it existed could also imagine a sound to represent it. In this way, language grew alongside craftsmanship, each fueling the other's rise. Imagine a small group gathered in the mouth of a cave. The night is cold, but the fire burns steadily. Sparks lift into the darkness, vanishing like tiny stars. A Neanderthal elder holds a flake of flint, showing a younger member how to strike it just so, how to feel the right edge beneath the fingers. The lesson is given not in long sentences, but in demonstration. A gesture, a sound, a shared smile when the tool breaks cleanly along the grain. Meaning flows between them like the firelight that passes from one face to another. It is in moments like these that language, as we know it, was born, not from a single invention, but from countless small exchanges of attention and imitation, a raised brow, a click of the tongue, a hum of approval. Gradually, these sounds and movements became more deliberate, carrying layers of meaning. Communication became the invisible thread that bound their communities together. Even today, in the flicker of a campfire or the shared glance of understanding between people, that ancient connection still lingers. We carry it unconsciously, the instinct to read gesture and tone, to sense meaning beyond words. The language of hands and fire never vanished. It became the foundation upon which every story, every song, every whisper of civilization would later stand. In the caves of Ice Age Europe, among the embers of ancient hearths, the first voices rose softly into the night. They spoke not only with sound, but with movement, with light, with presence. It was communication born of necessity and wonder, shaped by the same minds that carved stone and painted walls. And though time has taken their words, the echoes remain, in the curve of a handprint on stone, in the soot-stained ceilings of their caves, in the quiet understanding that passes between people even now. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and the early Homo sapiens all shared this gift. It was their common language, older than speech itself, the gentle, enduring language of hands and fire. Deep within the stone hearts of ancient caves, where the air hangs cool and still, something remarkable began to take shape. Long before history was written, before language took root in words, someone lifted a hand against the wall and left a mark. Not a tool, not a wound, a message, a pattern, a thought made visible. This was the beginning of art. For a long time, it was believed that this power to create, to make symbols, to imagine the unseen, belonged only to modern humans. The Neanderthals, people thought, were clever, but not creative, skilled, but not spiritual. That belief has slowly faded like smoke, replaced by something far more astonishing. In the caves of Spain, hidden behind curtains of stone and millennia of dust, evidence of Neanderthal artistry has been uncovered. 3 sites tell this story: La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardales. Each lies in a different corner of the Iberian Peninsula, yet all whisper the same truth. At La Pasiega, deep in Cantabria's rolling hills, a series of red lines and ladder-like symbols stretch across the walls. They are not random. Each was drawn carefully, deliberately, in pigment made from iron-rich ochre. Scientists dated the markings to more than 64,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before modern humans ever set foot in Europe. The artists could only have been Neanderthals. Farther west, in Maltravieso, a faint white handprint rests on the cave wall. Its edges are sharp, as if the artist had placed a hand there, then blown or spat pigment over it, leaving a pale outline surrounded by red dust. It is an image so simple, yet so profound, the trace of a life saying, "I was here." The pigment that remains is old beyond comprehension. It was laid down at least 66,000 years ago, a record of touch older than any story we have ever told. And to the south, in the cave of Ardales near Malaga, stalagmites rise like frozen waves of time. There, too, red pigment stains the formations, carefully placed along the contours of the stone. These marks were not accidents of nature. They were chosen, applied, perhaps renewed over generations. Whoever painted them understood color, form, and intention. In these caves, we see not only the beginnings of art, but the beginnings of self. Each symbol, each gesture, was a reflection of a mind aware of its own existence. The Neanderthals were not simply surviving the cold, they were shaping memory, they were creating meaning from the world around them, and in doing so, revealing something that had until then belonged only to the invisible realm of thought. To make art is to step outside of the present moment. It is to imagine something that is not there and bring it into being. It requires reflection, foresight, and connection, qualities that tie the artist to the viewer across time. When a Neanderthal pressed a hand to the stone and left its outline, they were not just marking a surface, they were marking a relationship between themselves and the place, between the living and the yet to be. Perhaps these symbols were not art as we define it now. They may have been signs, marks of belonging, boundaries of territory, or offerings to the unseen. Yet whatever their purpose, they were expressions of thought that stretched beyond the immediate. They transformed the cold stone of the cave into a mirror of human awareness. In the glow of firelight, those markings must have seemed alive. Shadows would dance over them, flickering like breath. A child might trace a finger along the red lines, while an elder watched silently, remembering who first made them. In that quiet, something deeply human unfolded, the recognition that stories could live beyond speech, that identity could be preserved in symbol. The pigments they used came from the earth itself: ochre, hematite, manganese, crushed, mixed with water or animal fat, then applied with fingers or brushes made from moss or fur. The process required patience and understanding. These were not careless splashes of color. They were acts of intention, acts of creation. Each stroke connected the maker to their world in a way that went far beyond survival. Art is memory made visible. It carries emotion without sound, presence without body. Through it, the Neanderthals left echoes of thought that still reach us, 60 millennia later. Their lines and handprints are not relics of a lost race, but windows into a shared mind, the same mind that still seeks beauty, still asks questions, still leaves marks behind. When we stand in those caves today, surrounded by the silence of deep time, we are not looking at primitive experiments. We are witnessing one of the first moments when consciousness reached outward and touched the world with imagination. It is the moment when thought became symbol and symbol became story. In that quiet exchange between hand and stone, the Neanderthals crossed a threshold that forever changed what it meant to be human. They may not have known the word for art. They may not have called themselves artists, but they understood, perhaps better than we give them credit for, that to leave a mark is to exist beyond one's own life, to say, softly and simply, we were here. And somewhere in the red glow of those ancient pigments, the first flicker of human self-awareness began to burn, a light that has never gone out. The Ice Age was a world of endurance. Across the vast plains of Europe, winds howled across frozen rivers and forests bowed beneath the weight of endless snow. Each winter seemed to stretch into the next, blurring seasons into a long, white silence. Yet even in such cold, life persisted. Families of early humans, both Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens, found ways to carve warmth out of the frozen earth. Their survival was not born from strength alone, but from patience, observation, and an ingenious understanding of how to shape the world into shelter. The land itself offered the first kind of refuge. Caves, with their deep mouths and protective stone walls, became havens against the wind. Some were small and narrow, filled with smoke from long-lived fires. Others opened into vast chambers, large enough to hold entire communities. Inside, the air stayed warmer than the outside frost, preserved by thick rock that held the memory of the sun. Over time, the walls darkened with soot and light scratches, signs of countless nights spent beside firelight, listening to its soft crackle as snow fell quietly beyond the entrance. In these natural shelters, humans learned to create homes within the earth. Stones were stacked to block drafts. Openings were covered with hides stretched tight and weighted with bones. Fire became the heart of every dwelling. Its heat radiated into the stone, its light turning the cave into a place not just of survival, but of life. Around the flames, food was cooked, tools were repaired, and stories were shared in the glow. But the Ice Age was not kind enough to grant caves everywhere. Many who wandered the open plains had to build their own sanctuaries from what the frozen land provided. They looked to the bones of giants. On the steppes of what is now Ukraine and Russia, archaeologists have uncovered circular dwellings made from the skeletons of woolly mammoths. These homes, built more than 20,000 years ago, are among the earliest examples of human architecture. The bones were arranged carefully, like the frame of a great tent. Massive tusks arched upward to form entrances. Ribs and leg bones were stacked in rings, interlocked with precision. Within those frames, Hides were stretched tightly to block the wind, their seams stitched with sinew and sealed with clay. Inside, the floor was lined with grass, moss, and animal fur to trap warmth. In the center, a small hearth burned day and night, its smoke curling up through a narrow gap in the roof. Even in temperatures that could freeze rivers solid, the air inside would remain warm enough for life to continue. The mammoth bone huts reveal the extraordinary skill and imagination of their builders. Each one required not only resources, but planning, gathering the right materials, selecting bones that would interlock, ensuring the structure would hold against heavy winds. Nothing was wasted. When a mammoth fell, it provided food, tools, and shelter all at once. The land itself became an extension of the human will to endure. Clothing, too, became a kind of shelter. In the coldest months, early humans wrapped themselves in the hides and furs of the animals they hunted. Each piece was cut and sewn with care, using bone needles and sinew thread. The thick pelts of reindeer and bison were prized for warmth. Layer upon layer, they built barriers between their skin and the air. Some wore boots lined with grass or feathers to keep feet dry. Others stitched hoods and mittens, transforming fur into armor against the cold. When food was scarce and the winds howled without pause, communities relied on their understanding of insulation. They dug shallow pits for sleeping, lining them with hides and warmed stones. They built windbreaks from branches and snow, shaping drifts into curved walls that reflected heat back toward the fire. In the flickering glow of their hearths, every movement was deliberate, every sound soft, a rhythm of survival practiced for thousands of years. These shelters, whether carved from caves or built upon the plains, were more than places to sleep. They were small worlds of light in a landscape of ice. Within them, children were born, tools were crafted, and the quiet bonds of kinship grew. The fire's reflection on stone walls was the only proof that warmth still existed in a world of cold stars. To live through an ice age required more than endurance. It demanded imagination, the ability to see potential in bone, hide, and earth. It required communication, the passing of techniques and knowledge from one generation to the next. The art of making shelter became one of humanity's oldest traditions, shaping not only how people lived, but how they thought. In every hearth's glow was the first hint of architecture, the first whisper of civilization. The mammoth bone huts, the fur-lined boots, the soot-streaked caves, all were acts of creativity born from necessity. Each spark of ingenuity carried the same quiet message: we belong here, even in the coldest of worlds. And as the ice deepened and the snow fell endlessly upon the earth, the fires still burned. They burned in caves, in huts, and in open camps beneath the stars. They burned in the eyes of those who refused to yield to the dark. Against the breath of glaciers and the long silence of winter, humanity built its first true walls of warmth, and within them, the story of survival found its steady, glowing heart. Across the frozen plains of Ice Age Europe, survival depended on the quiet balance between risk and reward. Every day was a dialogue with nature, measured in hunger and patience. The cold shaped everything, from the way fires were lit to the way people moved across the land. Food was not simply sustenance, it was the rhythm that connected entire communities, the thread that tied them to the earth and to one another. In this world, the hunt was both ritual and necessity. Mammoths, bison, and reindeer were the lifeblood of those who lived through the long winters. Each animal represented not just a meal, but an ecosystem of survival. A single mammoth, once brought down, could feed dozens of people, provide hides for shelter, bones for tools, and fat for fuel. But taking such a creature was never easy. It demanded courage, coordination, and knowledge passed carefully through generations. Hunters studied the land like a language. They read the wind to mask their scent, traced the faint prints left in snow, and waited for the right moment when strength and strategy aligned. Spears tipped with sharpened stone or hardened wood were thrown from close range, sometimes after days of tracking. In the stillness before the strike, one could almost hear the heartbeat of the earth itself. Reindeer herds were a more frequent prize, moving in vast numbers across the tundra. They were smaller and quicker than mammoths, but their migrations followed a predictable rhythm that early humans learned to anticipate. Families would camp along migration routes, waiting as thousands of animals passed through the valleys. Their movements were as much a calendar as a spectacle, marking the turn of seasons in a world without clocks. Once an animal was brought down, the work began. Every member of the group played a part. Tools made of flint, obsidian, and bone were used with precision. Blades cut cleanly through thick hide. Scrapers separated skin from flesh. Awls and chisels carved bone and sinew into cords and needles for future use. The act of butchery was not wasteful or hurried. It was practiced, efficient, and reverent. Nothing was left behind. The meat was shared among all, a tradition that built trust and bound the group together. Food was not merely distributed, but exchanged as a gesture of care and cooperation. In those dark winters, generosity was as vital as strength. Sharing meant survival. Fire, too, was a tool as important as any weapon. Its warmth softened the frozen meat and released its hidden nutrients. Cooking transformed what the hunt provided into something more nourishing and safe. Around the fire, fat dripped from roasting meat, hissing and sparking in the flames. The smell filled the air and clung to clothing and hair, marking the scent of life itself. Fire was also a means of preservation. In a land where cold could turn food to stone, people learned to smoke meat slowly, drying it over embers to last through the long months when prey was scarce. Animal fat was rendered and stored, used as fuel for lamps that flickered in caves and shelters. Even bones were cracked open to reach the marrow within, rich, oily, and vital. The firelight reflected on these small acts of resourcefulness, illuminating hands that worked tirelessly to keep hunger at bay. Modern science, through the study of ancient bones, has allowed us to listen to what those meals once contained. The chemical traces locked within skeletons, tiny variations in carbon and nitrogen, called isotopes, act like signatures of diet. From these, scientists have learned that both Neanderthals and early modern humans were skilled hunters who relied heavily on large mammals. Their bones reveal high levels of nitrogen, evidence of a meat-rich diet comparable to that of wolves or lions. Yet the story does not end with flesh alone. Along riverbanks and coastlines, traces of fish and freshwater shellfish tell of a diet that adapted to place and season. In some regions, plant residues have been found on ancient tools and in the plaque of fossilized teeth, hints of nuts, seeds, and tubers roasted in the fire. These small additions show that even in a world of ice, the human palate was curious and inventive. Hunting was not just about killing, but about understanding. To live among mammoths and reindeer required empathy, a kind of respect for the creatures that sustained life. Every pursuit was guided by an awareness of pattern, migration, breeding, and the changing light of the seasons. This knowledge was passed through observation and story, whispered beside the fire as children learned the movements of the herds before they ever held a spear. In the silence of those frozen landscapes, the echoes of these hunts still linger. The bones scattered across ancient plains, the flakes of stone sharpened by practiced hands, the charred marks of hearths long extinguished, all speak of a people who mastered balance. They took from the land what they needed, and in return they gave it their ingenuity, their patience, and their gratitude. For 100,000 years, through ice and wind, they lived by this unspoken pact. Fire and flesh, earth and bone, all parts of a single conversation between life and survival. And though time has buried their camps beneath soil and snow, their story remains etched in the chemistry of their bones and the quiet wisdom of the land they once called home. Before there were words carved into stone or stories painted on cave walls, there was sound, not the sound of engines or voices or cities, but the living music of the earth itself, a world shaped by wind, by ice, and by the slow, breathing rhythm of nature. The Ice Age was not silent, it was alive with texture and echo. Across the frozen plains, the air carried the deep groan of glaciers shifting in their sleep. Ice cracked like thunder, sending tremors through valleys where herds of mammoths grazed among frozen grasses. The wind sang low over the tundra, curling around the bones of trees and the ridges of snow. Sometimes it whispered, sometimes it howled, and beneath that ever-moving breath, life itself added its own quiet orchestra. Wolves called through the night, their voices stretching over miles of open ground. The heavy footfalls of bison and reindeer beat steady patterns against the frozen earth. Rivers, when they thawed, sang faintly beneath their ice, trickling like liquid glass. Even fire, that fragile flame humans guarded so carefully, crackled with its own soft percussion, the steady rhythm of survival. It was within this living soundscape that the first humans found rhythm, and with it, the beginnings of something entirely new. Long before the first civilizations, long before writing or architecture, there was music, not as a performance, but as a language of feeling, shared around flames and across generations. The earliest traces of this music still rest in the soil of southern Germany, deep within the Geisenklosterle cave. There, archaeologists uncovered something delicate, small enough to fit in a hand, yet powerful enough to change how we understand what it means to be human. A flute, carved from the hollow bone of a bird. Its age was staggering, around 40,000 years old, perhaps older still. Its maker, one of the earliest modern humans to walk through Europe, had shaped it with patience and understanding. Holes were pierced with precision, spaced in ways that would produce tones when air passed through them. It was not the product of accident, but of artistry. This was an instrument meant to sing. In the same layers of earth, fragments of other flutes were found, one made from mammoth ivory, another from the bone of a swan. Each had been smoothed, shaped, and hollowed carefully, likely by fire-heated tools. When replicas were played in modern times, their voices were soft and haunting, almost fragile, yet undeniably musical. They could form scales, melodies, even harmonies. It is humbling to think that 40 millennia ago, in the heart of an ice age, people listened to the same notes that we can still hear today. What inspired them to create these sounds? Perhaps it began as imitation. The call of birds overhead, the hollow tone of wind rushing through a cave's mouth, the rhythm of feet striking the earth during a hunt. Nature offered music freely, and humans learned to echo it, to turn its raw beauty into something deliberate, emotional, and shared. Music, like fire, became a bond between people. Around their hearths, early humans discovered that sound could draw them closer. A beat struck on stone or wood could steady a group's movement, whether in a hunt, in ritual, or in dance. A simple hum could soothe a restless child or accompany a story spoken in flickering light. The air, shaped by breath and intention, became a bridge between minds. There is evidence that rhythm itself was one of the earliest forms of communication beyond speech. The steady pattern of tapping, the repetition of sound, was something everyone could feel. It transcended words. Long before language was complex, rhythm allowed unity, guiding movement, coordinating effort, marking time. Even today, The human brain responds instinctively to beat and melody. That connection was born here, in the cold silence of prehistory, when hearts and hands first learned to move in sync. Imagine, for a moment, a night 40,000 years ago. The stars burn sharp above the snow. The wind has softened, leaving only the faint hiss of the fire. Around it, a small group gathers, men, women, and children wrapped in fur. Someone lifts a slender bone flute to their lips. The first note drifts into the air, high and trembling, followed by another, then another. The sound carries across the plain, mingling with the rustle of grass and the distant call of wolves. For a heartbeat, the night changes. The cold world listens, and in that listening, something new is born, not just sound, but meaning, a shared experience, a glimpse of the human soul. The Ice Age was harsh, but it was never without beauty. Its people carved music from emptiness, finding harmony in a landscape of wind and stone. The flutes of Geisenklosterl and the rhythms of their makers remind us that even in the coldest times, humans reached instinctively toward warmth, not only of fire, but of connection. Long before written history, before the Pervaish, first cities or gods, there was the quiet pulse of sound rising from a cave, carried by breath. That music was the first expression of memory, of emotion, of wonder. It was the moment when the human heart began to sing, and the world, for the first time, answered softly in return. There was a time when Europe itself seemed to sleep beneath a great white silence. The mountains, once green and full of rivers, had vanished beneath ice a mile thick. The valleys were buried, the seas had retreated, and the air was sharp enough to burn the lungs. It was the height of the last glacial maximum, around 21,000 years ago, the coldest heartbeat of the Ice Age. Glaciers stretched across the north, crawling down from the highlands like slow-moving oceans of stone. Their surfaces glittered under pale sunlight, broken by cracks that echoed like distant thunder. Beneath them, the land groaned under pressure, reshaped by the weight of centuries of snow. Rivers froze and vanished. Forests thinned into skeletal traces, their branches coated in frost so thick they shone like glass. Much of northern Europe lay beneath this frozen armor. From the British Isles to Scandinavia, the land was hidden under sheets of ice that reached the sea. Even the great Alps were swallowed by glaciers that carved new valleys and left behind scars still visible today. Sea levels fell by more than 100 meters, revealing wide plains that once slept beneath the waves. The North Sea became dry land, a cold grassland stretching between Britain and the continent. Scientists now call this vanished region Doggerland, a bridge where mammoths and humans once walked side by side. To the south, the world was not as buried, but it was no less harsh. The climate swung between extremes, its rhythm unsteady and unpredictable. Blizzards swept across the plains, then eased into brief summers of gray skies and stunted grass. Herds of reindeer, bison, and wild horses moved restlessly in search of food, followed by small bands of humans who had learned to live at the edge of endurance. The people of this age knew the cold as an unending companion. They wrapped themselves in layers of fur and sinew, their faces weathered by wind and snow. The world around them was vast and empty, a quiet ocean of white. Fire was no longer just warmth, but memory, a small flame that reminded them the world could still glow. Human life had retreated southward into pockets of refuge where the land still offered enough to survive. In what are now Spain, Italy, and the Balkans, valleys remained open, forests clung to life, and rivers still flowed freely. These southern sanctuaries became havens for both humans and animals, places where the rhythm of the Ice Age softened just enough for life to continue. In these refuges, early Homo sapiens endured, carrying with them tools, songs, and the faint memory of warmer times. The cold shaped not only their bodies but their minds. It demanded foresight, cooperation, and patience. Each generation passed on the skills needed to hunt in the snow, to store food through the darkness, and to find beauty in the stillness of the frozen world. Farther north, where the ice pressed hardest, the Neanderthals were fading. For hundreds of thousands of years, they had ruled the European landscape. They had endured previous cold ages, had adapted to the dark winters, and had thrived among the mammoths and cave lions. But this time, something was different. The climate changed too quickly, swinging from cold to brief warmth, then back again. The great herds shifted southward, leaving the Neanderthals' territories empty and barren. Populations scattered, cut off from one another. Fewer births, longer winters, and diminishing food wore away their numbers like wind over stone. Some may have still lived in small pockets, holding on as the ice advanced. Their fires burned low in hidden valleys, their footprints slowly erased by snow. And yet, even as they vanished, they left traces that endured, stone tools buried in frost, hearths sealed beneath layers of sediment, DNA that would flow quietly into the blood of future generations. The Neanderthals were not entirely gone. Part of them continued, carried within us, remembered, in ways they could never have imagined. The Ice Age reached its peak and held the continent in stillness for thousands of years. The air was so cold that even the sound of a bird's wings seemed muted. Yet life never surrendered completely. In the cracks between glaciers, moss grew. In the coastal shallows, seals swam under frozen waves. And in caves across southern Europe, human hands painted red and black symbols, the warmth of imagination flickering against the cold walls of reality. Europe's frozen heart beat slowly through that long winter of the planet's history. The ice-shaped mountains, carved rivers, and tested every living creature that called the continent home. But beneath that cold silence, life waited, breathing quietly in the shadows, dreaming of spring. When the glaciers finally began to retreat, they left behind more than valleys and plains. They left a world transformed, a canvas for rebirth. The people who had survived in the refuges would rise from their prophet shelters, carrying with them the strength and memory of the age they had endured. And though the ice would melt, the echo of that frozen heart would remain forever etched into Europe's bones. For a time, the continent belonged to the cold, to the wind, and to those who could bend without breaking. It was an era of stillness and resilience, of life pared down to its most essential form. And in that quiet endurance, humanity found something that would never fade, the knowledge that even in the deepest winter, warmth can always return. In the stillness of caves and the deep silence of permafrost, the past never fully sleeps. It lingers there, hidden within the smallest of things, a grain of dust, a flake of bone, a drop of ancient blood turned to powder. For a long time, these traces were invisible, beyond the reach of science. The bones of the Ice Age told stories through shape and wear, but their voices were faint, eroded by time. Then, in the last few decades, a quiet revolution began. Scientists learned to read what was once unreadable, the genetic whispers preserved within ancient remains. This is the story of DNA time travel, where the language of life itself becomes a bridge across tens of thousands of years. Every cell of a living creature carries a code, written in spiraling strands of molecules, the blueprint of body, mind, and inheritance. DNA is fragile, and yet, in the right conditions, it can survive far longer than anyone once imagined. Deep within cold caves, inside bones protected from heat and moisture, fragments of this code remain intact long after flesh and memory have faded. The secret lies in the microscopic world. When scientists search for ancient DNA, They begin not with large fossils, but with dust, the soft powder that gathers at the base of bones or clings to stone tools. It is handled with extraordinary care, for the slightest touch of modern skin can drown out the ancient signal. In laboratories sealed against contamination, technicians wear masks, gloves, and full suits, moving carefully as if performing surgery on time itself. They drill into bone or tooth, collecting particles so small they look like mist. Within that powder, hidden between minerals and silence, lie the molecular remains of life long gone. The DNA is broken, its strands shattered into fragments by the passing of centuries, but with patience and precision, it can be pieced back together. Each segment is like a torn scrap of a long-lost manuscript. By aligning these scraps again and again, scientists can reconstruct the entire text, not of words, but of ancestry. Few people have shaped this field as profoundly as Svante Pääbo. His work began with an idea that sounded almost impossible: to recover DNA from ancient humans and their relatives. For years, the task seemed hopeless. The material was too degraded, too contaminated, too faint to interpret. Yet through perseverance and innovation, he and his team achieved what had once been only a dream. In the early 2000s, Pääbo's laboratory at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology unlocked the Neanderthal genome, the complete set of genetic instructions from our long-lost cousins. For the first time, scientists could look directly into the code that defined them, and by comparing it to our own, discover how intertwined our stories truly were. The results were astonishing. Hidden within modern human DNA were unmistakable traces of Neanderthal ancestry. This proved that our species had not only met, but mingled. Later discoveries revealed yet another branch of ancient humanity, the Denisovans, known first only from a fragment of finger bone found in Siberia's Denisova cave. From that single shard, Pääbo's team reconstructed an entire genome, revealing a group of humans no one had ever seen before, yet whose genes still live on in people today, especially among populations in Asia and Oceania. These breakthroughs transformed the way we understand our past. Ancient DNA revealed that human history was not a straight line, but a web, a network of crossings, encounters, and shared legacies. The story of the Ice Age was not only one of separation, but of connection, written in the invisible script of our cells. Through DNA, scientists can now trace the migrations of early humans as they moved across continents. They can see when groups split apart, when they met again, and when one population quietly disappeared. Each discovery brings the long timeline of human evolution into sharper focus, not as a single story of replacement, but as a conversation between species. Even the soils of caves now yield genetic secrets. In some sites where no bones remain, scientists have found traces of DNA in the surrounding sediment, the lingering fingerprints of those who once lived or passed through. The ground itself remembers. A handful of earth can now tell who slept there, who cooked by the fire, who vanished into time. This science does more than reveal ancestry. It restores presence. It allows the lost to speak again, not in words or sound, but in the intimate voice of molecules. The DNA of a Neanderthal woman from Croatia, for example, can tell us what diseases her people resisted. The DNA of a Denisovan man can show how high-altitude genes helped his descendants thrive in the mountains of Tibet. Even fragments from Ice Age animals, mammoths, wolves, cave bears, paint a fuller picture of the world our ancestors shared. In a sense, ancient genomics has given us a new kind of time machine. It does not transport us backward, but brings the past forward, folding its secrets into the present moment. Each sample, once analyzed, becomes a bridge between worlds, between bone and memory, between extinction and survival. The work continues quietly, often in rooms lit only by the glow of instruments, where scientists trace life through the delicate patterns of code. Every sequence reconstructed is a resurrection of understanding, proof that nothing living is ever entirely lost. The breath of the Ice Age, the hands that painted caves, the children who laughed beside ancient fires, their stories still flow through us, encoded in the deep currents of our own DNA. Through this science, we are reminded that the past is not gone. It sleeps within us, written in a language older than words, waiting for patient minds to read it once more. Far to the east, beyond the plains and frozen rivers of Ice Age Europe, there were other humans moving through the mountains and forests of Asia. They were not Neanderthals, and not quite like us either. Their bones were rare, their faces long vanished, but their story has quietly endured in the deep code of our DNA. They are the Denisovans, a mysterious branch of humanity known not from what they built or wrote, but from the traces they left behind in the earth and within ourselves. Their name comes from a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, where the wind sweeps cold through the trees and the snow falls in slow silence. Inside that cave, protected from time by layers of dust and darkness, a fragment of finger bone was found in 1998. It was small enough to fit on a fingertip, belonging perhaps to a young girl who lived more than 50,000 years ago. For over a decade, no one realized how extraordinary it was. When scientists finally examined the DNA preserved within that tiny bone, the results revealed something no one expected. It was not Neanderthal. It was not modern human. It belonged to an entirely different kind of human, one that had lived and thrived across the eastern half of the ancient world. That single fragment opened a new chapter in the human story, introducing a lineage that had been hidden in plain sight. We know very little about what the Denisovans looked like. The few bones we have, a tooth, a fragment of skull, the piece of finger, are not enough to reconstruct a full body with confidence. Yet through DNA, a faint image begins to emerge. They were close cousins of the Neanderthals, sharing a common ancestor roughly 500,000 years ago, and they likely resembled them in strength and build. Their lives were shaped by high mountains, deep forests, and cold plateaus, where endurance was the price of survival. The reach of the Denisovans extended far beyond the mountains where they were discovered. Their DNA has been found across Asia and the Pacific, woven into the genomes of people from Tibet to Papua New Guinea. This shows that they were travelers, spreading across vast landscapes, interbreeding with early modern humans along the way. In Tibet, their genetic gift endures most visibly, a single adaptation that helps modern highland populations survive the thin air of high altitude. This adaptation centers on a gene called EPAS1, inherited directly from Denisovans. It allows red blood cells to carry oxygen efficiently in places where the air is scarce and the wind bites with cold precision. Without it, life above 4,000 meters would be far more difficult. That one genetic thread, passed down across tens of thousands of years, still shapes the breath of people who live close to the sky. Other Denisovan genes have quietly aided survival too. Some influence the human immune system, helping it recognize and fight unfamiliar pathogens. Others affect the skin, hair, and metabolism, small adjustments that hint at lives spent in climates very different from Europe's. These fragments of genetic inheritance are like faint fingerprints pressed into the fabric of humanity, reminders that adaptation is rarely solitary. The discovery of Denisovan DNA near the edges of Europe, in traces mingled with that of Neanderthals, reveals something deeper about the world of the Ice Age. It was not divided into isolated realms, but connected by slow and steady movement. Populations met, mixed, and drifted apart again, leaving behind invisible bridges between continents. Even as glaciers sealed the north and deserts stretched across the south, human groups found ways to reach one another through valleys, across steppes, and along coasts now buried beneath the sea. This mingling reminds us that the human story was never confined to straight lines or clean separations. Each species and population shaped the others in ways neither could have imagined. The people who would one day populate Europe carried with them genetic echoes from faraway ancestors. The Neanderthals gave us endurance in cold climates, the Denisovans offered resilience in high altitudes, and modern humans brought imagination, language, and innovation. Together, they formed a mosaic of survival that still lives within our cells. What makes the Denisovan discovery so profound is not only that it adds a new branch to the human family tree, but that it reveals how intertwined those branches were. The ancient world was a web of contact, migration, and shared existence. Every cave, every mountain pass, every river valley held meetings between different kinds of people, not always peaceful, but often intimate enough to leave lasting marks. The Denisovans never left behind cave art or tools as recognizable as those of their Neanderthal cousins. They did not etch their thoughts into stone or carve their memory into ivory, yet through their DNA, they speak to us more directly than they ever could have. Through words, they remind us that even those who vanished from history are still here, living quietly in the bloodstream of their descendants. At the edge of Europe, where the steppe fades into mountain shadow, traces of their genes can still be found. They whisper of ancient journeys across continents, of moments when different peoples met beneath the same sky, and of a world far more connected than the maps of the past once suggested. The Denisovans may have disappeared as a distinct species, but they did not truly fade. Like the Neanderthals before them, they became part of us, their endurance folded into ours, their adaptations still guiding our breath. And so, even in their absence, they remain woven into the quiet continuity of life, reminding us that humanity has never been one story, but a chorus of many voices carried forward through time. There are moments in Earth's story that end not with a great noise, but with silence. The disappearance of the Neanderthals was one such moment. Around 40,000 years ago, the people who had survived the frost and fire of Europe for hundreds of millennia began to fade. Their tools stopped appearing in caves where they had once lived. Their fires went cold in valleys that had known their footsteps for ages, and slowly, the rhythm of their presence, once steady as the turning of the seasons, fell quiet. For more than 300,000 years, the Neanderthals had endured everything the planet could offer. They had lived through glacial winters and brief interludes of green warmth. They had hunted mammoth and bison, shaped stone and bone, and even left traces of thought and art in hidden caverns. Yet their long mastery of Europe came to an end in a way that leaves more mystery than clarity. There was no single cause, no dramatic catastrophe. Instead, their fading seems to have been a quiet unraveling, a slow merging with time itself. By the time modern humans spread widely across Europe, the Neanderthals were already few in number. Their populations had always been small, scattered in isolated groups, separated by mountains, rivers, and the wide, cold steppes. Genetic studies show that they were never many, perhaps only tens of thousands across the entire continent. Small numbers meant fragility. A harsh winter, a failed hunting season, or disease could erase entire communities. Each loss rippled through their fragile web of survival. Climate was a constant companion and, in the end, perhaps their greatest test. Around 40,000 years ago, Europe's weather turned violent once again. Sudden shifts in temperature brought drought and cold in uneven rhythms. Grasslands shrank, forests withdrew, and the great herds upon which the Neanderthals depended began to wander elsewhere. Food became harder to find. Their bodies, built strong and broad for the chill, were perfect for endurance but costly to feed. As the landscape changed, the old ways of hunting and gathering no longer sustained them as easily as before. Meanwhile, new people were arriving. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, had crossed into Europe from the south and east, carrying with them new tools, new strategies, and larger social networks. They were more numerous, better connected, and often more mobile. They built shelters quickly, traveled in wider groups, and exchanged knowledge over vast distances. Where the Neanderthals had lived in small bands, these newcomers were part of a web of communities that stretched across continents. It is tempting to imagine that this meeting led to conflict, but the evidence tells a gentler story. There are no signs of war, no layers of burned villages, or mass graves. Instead, the archaeological record shows a long overlap, perhaps thousands of years, where both species shared the same lands, sometimes even the same caves. The Neanderthals' own tools began to resemble those of modern humans, suggesting exchange, imitation, or collaboration. They met, they mingled, and they shared more than space. Genetic evidence now tells us that their story did not end in total separation. Every person alive today who has ancestry outside Africa carries a small fraction of Neanderthal DNA, about 1 to 2% of their genome. This means that in some valleys and forests, Neanderthals and modern humans lived together closely enough for their families, their lives, and their bloodlines to intertwine. In that sense, part of them never disappeared at all. But the pure Neanderthal populations, those who had lived in Europe since long before our species arrived, continued to shrink. In their last centuries, their range narrowed to a few strongholds in the far south, where the climate was milder and resources lasted longer. Places like Gibraltar's Gorum's Cave became their final refuges. There, archaeologists have found the last traces of their fires, the charcoal remains of their meals, and markings on stone walls that might have carried meaning once known only to them. The end was not sudden. It unfolded over generations. Perhaps there was no awareness that it was happening at all. Children were still born, fires were still lit, hunts still took place beneath pale skies. But with each passing season, the world grew emptier of their kind. Groups that once traded or met by chance no longer did. The land reclaimed their trails. One winter, the last of them may have looked out across the sea or the frozen steppe and seen no others like themselves. There was no massacre, no final battle, only the quiet passing of a lineage that had shaped this land for hundreds of thousands of years. When their fires went out for the last time, they left behind no monument, no farewell. Yet their memory endured in a different way, carried invisibly in the DNA of those who followed. Even now, within our cells, a small part of the Neanderthal story continues to hum. Their endurance helped shape our resilience. Their blood, their strength, their quiet intelligence became part of what we are. The people who once watched Europe's ice and wind have not vanished entirely. They remain in the warmth of our breath, in the shape of our bones, and in the ancient echo of our shared humanity. Their disappearance was not the end of a people, but the blending of histories. And in that blending, the Neanderthals found a strange kind of immortality, not carved into stone or written in story, but carried gently in the living memory of humankind. At the far edge of Europe, where mountains give way to sea, there is a cave that looks out across the Strait of Gibraltar. The wind there smells of salt and dust, and the waves beat endlessly against the limestone cliffs. To stand at its entrance is to feel time slow down, as if the earth itself is remembering. This place is called Gorum's Cave, and within its cool darkness lie the last whispers of a people who once ruled this continent, the final Neanderthals. By the time their footsteps reached this southern shore, their world had already grown small. The ice was closing in across northern Europe. Forests had thinned, rivers had frozen, and the great herds they once followed had drifted far away to find gentler lands. The Neanderthals who made it to Gibraltar were among the last survivors of their kind. They had traveled south as the cold tightened its grip, drawn by the mild air of the Mediterranean coast and the sheltering arms of the cliffs. Here, they found a refuge where the sea still offered fish and shellfish, and the land gave them birds, rabbits, and the occasional deer. Inside the cave, the air is cool and still. The ceiling is low. The walls glisten faintly where moisture seeps through the stone. It was a place of safety, an ancient home that looked out toward the horizon, where on clear days one could see Africa across the water. Fires once burned here, their smoke curling toward the ceiling. The ground still holds their traces: ash from hearths, cracked shells, and the bones of hunted animals. The tools they left behind are small, delicate reminders of practiced hands. Sharp stone flakes and scrapers, still edged enough to cut, lie buried beneath layers of sand. They were crafted from flint, shaped through the same quiet rhythm that had guided Neanderthal life for hundreds of thousands of years. Each tool tells of familiarity, of skill passed from one generation to the next, even as those generations dwindled. Among the walls of Gorum's cave, archaeologists found something else, something almost startling in its intimacy. A set of markings carved into the rock, 8 lines, crossed and deliberate, cut deep into the stone as if made with intention rather than accident. No one knows their meaning. Perhaps they were marks of counting, perhaps symbols of presence. But whatever their purpose, they speak of a mind that reached beyond the practical, a hand that wanted to leave something behind, a trace of thought, a moment of self. The Neanderthals of Gibraltar lived here roughly 40,000 years ago, at a time when the world was changing rapidly. To the north, modern humans had already spread through Europe. They painted walls with ochre and charcoal, their images of bison and horses glowing in the light of flickering fires. In the same breath of history as our ancestors painted their dreams, the Neanderthals' fires burned lower and dimmer. The landscape around them was raw and beautiful. Cliffs dropped steeply into blue water. Above, seabirds wheeled in the sky, their cries carried by the wind. The nights were filled with the hiss of waves, the crackle of fire, and the soft murmur of human voices. They gathered at the cave's mouth to eat, to rest, to watch the endless horizon. The sea provided what the land no longer could. Mussels, limpets, and seals became part of their diet, proof of their adaptability until the very end. Even here, at the edge of the continent, they showed resilience. They endured until endurance itself became impossible. And then, one day, the fires stopped. The last Neanderthal hearth cooled, its embers fading to gray ash. The cave fell silent. Wind and salt carried away the traces of smoke. Outside, the tides rolled on, erasing footprints from the sand. The earth did not mark their passing with disaster or violence, only with quiet. Their disappearance was not a single moment but a slow fading, like the dimming of twilight. While our ancestors painted deep inside caves in France and Spain, celebrating life and myth, the Neanderthals' world narrowed to this small corner of the South. It is haunting to think that somewhere on these same coasts, 2 kinds of humans may have watched the same sunset, one at the dawn of artistic expression, the other at the dusk of an entire lineage. Yet Gorum's cave remains. It keeps the memory of their final chapter, preserved in the shadows of its walls and the salt in its air. Every fragment found within it, a tool, a bone, a hand mark, carries the same quiet message. They lived here, they thought, they worked, they hoped, and they looked out at the same sea that still moves beneath the cliffs today. To visit the cave is to stand at the meeting point of endings and beginnings. The Neanderthals did not vanish through violence or failure. They simply reached the edge of their long journey and left the rest of the path to others. Their story did not end with their extinction, but continued, carried in the echoes of their minds, their genes, and the enduring mark of their presence upon the land. And so, the last of their kind stand not as ghosts, but as quiet companions in our ancestry. Their final home at Gibraltar is more than a grave of stone. It is a testament to endurance, to adaptation, and to the gentle truth that even as species fade, their memory flows onward, folded into the long breath of humanity itself. The ice began to breathe again. For thousands of years, glaciers that had once locked the northern lands in silence began to soften, their edges retreating under a warming sky. Valleys that had lain buried beneath walls of ice revealed their bones once more. Rivers, stones, and soil awakening beneath the slow melt. Across these thawing plains, new life crept forward. Grass spread where there had once been frost. Herds of reindeer and bison returned to graze, and with them came the quiet, persistent footsteps of modern humans. The world the Neanderthals had once ruled was changing into something else, something younger and more crowded with possibility. Europe was no longer the harsh frontier it had been during the long glacial reign. As the ice retreated, it left behind a mosaic of open tundra, dense forests, and river valleys that shimmered with fish. This was the stage upon which Homo sapiens, our ancestors, would flourish. They were no longer wanderers on the edge of survival. Here, they began to build a world that felt more like home. They spread northward from the southern refuges of the continent, following the seasons and the migrations of animals. Camps became more permanent, and the traces of these early settlements still whisper their presence across France, Italy, and the plains of Central Europe. Hearths ringed with stones, fragments of bone carved with care, and the earliest outlines of small dwellings mark this transformation. These people were not just survivors of an ice age, they were the architects of new cultures. Archaeologists would later give their ways of life names: Gravettian, Solutrean, Magdalenian, words that describe not tribes or nations, but patterns of thought and craft that stretched across thousands of years. Each culture left behind tools and art that reflect a growing depth of imagination. The Gravettian people shaped slender blades of flint and fashioned delicate figurines from ivory and stone. The Magdalenian artists carved, antler, and painted vast murals within caves that glowed in firelight. The art of this new Europe carried a richness unseen before. In the depths of limestone caverns, they painted not merely to record, but to remember. Herds of bison, horses, and mammoths emerged in ochre and charcoal, their forms alive with motion and grace. Hands pressed against the cave walls left prints like signatures, proof of human presence in a world both vast and fragile. It was as if, after so many generations of hardship, the human spirit had found its voice in color and rhythm. Music and ornament accompanied this new creativity. Flutes carved from bird bone or mammoth ivory filled the night air with soft, trembling notes. Shells and teeth were strung into necklaces that clattered softly when their wearers moved. Some pieces were dyed with red ochre, others polished until they gleamed in the light of the hearth. Each object carried meaning, perhaps beauty, perhaps ritual, a shared language of symbols that stretched across distances and generations. The Magdalenian period, flourishing around 17,000 years ago, marked a peak in adaptation and artistry. People hunted reindeer and wild horses across open plains, following the cycles of the seasons with precision. They built shelters from bones, hides, and branches, creating spaces that were not merely temporary camps, but true homes. Children grew up in communities that understood the land intimately, its rhythms, its dangers, its gifts. Population increased slowly, but noticeably. With warmer climates came abundance. Rivers teemed with fish, forests offered fruit and nuts, and plains provided game. Where once life had been a fragile balance between scarcity and survival, now it was a dance of planning, trade, and shared knowledge. Groups began to connect across long distances, exchanging goods and ideas, creating networks that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Carpathians. The people of the New Europe carried in their bodies the blended heritage of those who had come before. Traces of Neanderthals and Denisovans mingled within their blood, quiet reminders of a shared lineage. Yet their world was unmistakably different. The continent that had once held many kinds of humans was now home to one. The silence left by extinction had become the background hum of expansion. Even so, the echoes of the old world lingered. They lived close to the bones of their ancestors, often settling near the same rivers and caves where Neanderthals had once made fire. Perhaps they saw the ancient carvings on walls and wondered who had made them. Perhaps they felt, as we might, the weight of unseen memory in those stone chambers. As the ice continued to retreat, Europe transformed. The great glaciers pulled back into the far north, freeing land that had not felt the sun for tens of thousands of years. Lakes formed from melting ice, rivers changed their courses, and the coastline shifted. Forests spread where tundra once stretched, and humans followed the new growth, shaping their tools and their lives to meet it. This was the moment when the continent truly became theirs. No longer visitors, they became the stewards of its landscapes. They adapted not only to survive, but to create. Their stories, sung and painted, began to weave the first threads of culture as we know it. Art, music, myth, and memory merging into a single current that still flows through us today. In this new Europe, life was no longer defined solely by endurance. It was guided by reflection, invention, and a quiet claim upon the land. The Ice Age was ending, and with it, the age of shared humanity gave way to something new, an era in which one species, carrying the legacy of all who came before, would shape the world in its own image. The ice had withdrawn, but in its wake, it left a continent full of promise, light, and remembrance, the cradle of human dominion, where survival had finally become civilization. By the time the last of the ice began to loosen its hold on the world, the Neanderthals were gone, and only one kind of human walked beneath the pale European sky. But the question lingered, then and now, like an echo through the ages. What made us different? It was not strength. The Neanderthals had been stronger. Their arms and shoulders carried the memory of generations who hunted close and fought the cold head-on. It was not endurance. They had survived 500,000 years of shifting climates, from blazing heat to frozen silence. Nor was it intelligence in the way we often imagine. Their tools were clever, their shelters sturdy, their knowledge vast. Yet, somehow, our lineage continued while theirs did not. The answer lies in the quiet spaces between those facts, in how we connected, how we imagined, and how we learned to live through one another. Our ancestors, the early Homo sapiens who spread across Ice Age Europe, were born into communities that reached beyond the campfire. Where a Neanderthal band might have lived in groups of a few families, humans formed networks that stretched across valleys and rivers. They traded stones, shells, and pigments from faraway places, linking one camp to another in invisible threads of cooperation. These networks acted like lifelines, allowing knowledge, materials, and support to flow even when food was scarce or the weather turned brutal. Such cooperation was not only practical but emotional. Within human groups, bonds extended beyond bloodlines. There was sharing, teaching, and caring for the weak in ways that echoed through generations. Fossil evidence shows that early modern humans, like their Neanderthal cousins, cared for the injured and the old. But they also did something more subtle. They created extended childhoods. Human children grew slowly, their brains expanding long after birth. This long period of dependency demanded patience and collaboration. Entire groups helped raise each generation, giving time for young minds to learn through play, mimicry, and imagination. In those long, unhurried years of growth, stories began to form, tales told beside the fire, games that mirrored the hunt, songs that carried lessons. Imagination became a tool of survival, allowing our ancestors to see not only what was, but what could be. Through this lens of imagination, humans began to move differently through the world. They looked at stone and saw the shape of a blade within it. They looked at the stars and began to wonder if patterns hid meanings. A new way of thinking emerged, not just about surviving, but about understanding. Language deepened that transformation. While Neanderthals almost certainly communicated through speech and gesture, our species developed language into something richer and more layered. Words could carry not only warnings or directions, but ideas, stories, and dreams. A person could describe something that was not present, a hunt to come, a danger remembered, a god imagined. With that power came a shared inner world where minds could connect across time and distance. Symbolic communication became the heart of culture. The paintings that spread through Ice Age caves were not just decoration, they were evidence of shared meaning. Each mark carried thought, a memory, a hope, perhaps even a prayer. Humans painted herds on walls, carved figures from ivory, and sang to the rhythm of hollow bones. These acts united people through a language of symbols, binding them with a sense of belonging that reached beyond the individual. This collective imagination changed everything. It allowed humans to plan hunts that spanned days, to adapt quickly to shifting climates, and to cooperate with distant groups. It was the foundation of empathy, the ability to picture another's mind and act for their sake. That empathy, born of imagination, became our greatest adaptation. Even the simple act of storytelling was a kind of tool. Around campfires, people spoke of ancestors, animals, and spirits that watched over them. These stories carried practical wisdom: how to track a herd, how to find shelter, how to read the sky. But they also carried unity. A shared story meant a shared identity. It told a group not just how to live, but why. Over generations, that storytelling grew into something larger, memory preserved across time. A song could outlive its singer, a tale could outlast its teller. Culture itself became a living thread, passed from one mind to another, stronger than bone or blood. Cooperation, imagination, and communication, these were the quiet forces that tipped the balance. Where other humans faced the limits of isolation, Homo sapiens wove connection. They built invisible webs of thought and trust that allowed them to survive change after change, ice after ice. And perhaps, most beautifully, they began to see themselves as part of something greater, a shared story that stretched beyond the individual, beyond the tribe, beyond even the living. It was this widening of perspective, this ability to think in layers of time and meaning, that marked the true dawn of humanity as we know it. In the end, what made us different was not a sharper tool or a larger brain. It was the spark of connection, the instinct to share, to imagine, to remember. That quiet, unbroken chain of minds, linked through care and creativity, carried us through every storm that followed. And though countless ages have passed since those first storytellers watched their fires flicker against the cave walls, the flame they lit has never gone out. For a long time, the Neanderthals were painted as shadows of ourselves, creatures who looked almost human but lacked our spark. In old museums, they were shown stooped and heavy-browed, their eyes dull, their hands clumsy. The story went that they were replaced, outsmarted, or crushed beneath the progress of Homo sapiens. It was an easy story to tell, one that placed us as the inevitable victors. But time, like truth, has a way of softening arrogance. Today, that old tale has begun to fade. What we once saw as a primitive cousin has revealed itself to be something far more complex, far more human than we ever allowed ourselves to believe. The Neanderthals were not inferior, they were simply adapted to a different world. For hundreds of thousands of years, they lived in the heart of the Ice Age, sculpted by cold and scarcity into beings of remarkable endurance. Their bodies were shorter and stronger, built to conserve heat. Their lungs were broad, their hands powerful, their bones thick with the memory of labor. They were not designed for speed or elegance, but for survival in a world that demanded patience and strength. While our ancestors roamed widely, following herds across open plains, Neanderthals stayed close to their home ranges, mastering every valley and mountain ridge they inhabited. They knew the land intimately, every cave, every stream, every migration path. Archaeological sites across Europe show a deep familiarity with the rhythms of the earth. They chose places not by chance, but with a keen sense of landscape, always near water, shelter, and the paths of animals. For decades, their tools were seen as crude, but closer study revealed precision. They crafted stone blades with symmetrical edges, hafted them onto wooden handles with plant resin, and shaped spears balanced for close-range hunting. Their craftsmanship was quiet, steady, and deliberate. They did not waste, nor did they rush. Their way of life did not need constant innovation, for it already worked. The myth of their inferiority was born not from science, but from pride. Early archaeologists, finding their bones beside simple tools, assumed lack of imagination. They could not imagine that intelligence might look different from their own. It took time and technology to hear what the bones were truly saying. When microscopic studies revealed wear patterns on tools identical to those of our ancestors, and when traces of pigment were found clinging to shells and ornaments, the story began to shift. The Neanderthals, it seemed, had also created beauty. In caves like La Pasiega and Maltravieso in Spain, paintings of red lines and dots date back more than 60,000 years, older than any known human art. And at that time, only Neanderthals lived in those regions. Their marks were not accidents. They were deliberate, layered, repeated. Some scholars think they may have carried symbolic meaning, perhaps marking territory or memory, perhaps something we cannot yet name. Whatever their purpose, they show a mind capable of abstraction, of thinking beyond the moment. They cared for one another too. Fossils show signs of injuries that healed long after they should have been fatal, proof that others had tended to the sick and elderly. In Shanidar Cave, a Neanderthal was buried with wildflowers, their pollen still detectable in the soil. Whether that act was symbolic or practical does not matter as much as what it represents, a gesture of care in a cold and difficult world. So, why did we misunderstand them for so long? Perhaps because we wanted to see ourselves as exceptional, to admit that another kind of human had shared our abilities. Language, empathy, art blurred the line between us and them. It challenged the comfort of being the only storytellers on Earth. But the more we uncover, the clearer it becomes that humanity was never a single flame, but a constellation of fires burning side by side. The Neanderthals vanished around 40,000 years ago, but their legacy remains, quietly woven into us. We carry fragments of their DNA, genes that shape our immune systems, our skin, even the way we sleep. Their endurance lingers in our blood, a whisper of their resilience passed from generation to generation. Extinction, it turns out, does not always mean disappearance. They were not erased. They were absorbed. Their story did not end, it became part of ours. When we speak of us and them, we forget that the boundary was never clean. The children of those ancient unions carried both lineages forward, blending strength with curiosity, endurance with imagination. In truth, what separates us from the Neanderthals is not greatness, but fortune. They thrived in a world of ice, and when that world shifted, their way of life slowly unraveled. Ours continued only because the changes favored our form, our habits, our wider networks. If the climate had been different, perhaps it would be our bones buried beneath theirs. The Neanderthals remind us that evolution does not choose winners, only survivors. They teach us humility, that intelligence wears many faces, and that the measure of success is not always in endurance, but in connection. In the quiet chambers of ancient caves, their marks still cling to stone. In the code of our cells, their memory hums softly. And in the long story of life on Earth, their chapter remains open, not as a tale of failure, but as a testament to what it means to be human. Many forms, one shared spark, flickering together for a moment in the dark. If you could look deep within yourself, past the surface of your skin, past the quiet rhythm of your heart, into the microscopic spirals of your DNA, you would find ghosts there. They are not ghosts of fear or sorrow, but of memory, echoes of lives that ended 40,000 years ago. Their names have faded from the world, yet their essence lingers in every heartbeat of those who came after. Each person alive today who descends from the populations that left Africa carries within them a faint inheritance from the Neanderthals. It is not visible in the mirror, nor heard in the sound of a voice, yet it rests quietly in our cells, guiding tiny parts of who we are. When scientists first discovered this in the early years of ancient DNA research, it felt like an awakening, proof that the line between us and them had never truly been a line at all. It was a meeting, a blending, a shared survival written into biology. These traces are small, only about 1 to 2% of the genome in most people of European or Asian ancestry, yet their influence reaches far beyond what those numbers suggest. Within that small portion lies a library of adaptations shaped by an Ice Age world, preserved through the bodies of those who endured it. Some of these inherited genes shape the surface of our skin. Neanderthals, who lived for hundreds of thousands of years in Europe's pale light, had already adapted to low sunlight and cold climates. They carried variations that influenced the production of melanin, the pigment that gives color to skin and hair. Those same variations entered our lineage when the two species met and mingled, helping early humans adjust to life outside Africa. The fairness of some complexions, the reddish tints in certain hair, may whisper faintly of that ancient mixture. Other genes affect how our immune systems recognize the world. Neanderthals lived close to the ground, among herds and scavengers, in contact with countless bacteria and viruses that thrived in Ice Age Europe. Over time, their immune defenses became strong and finely tuned to those environments. When modern humans interbred with them, they inherited some of these genetic shields, small molecular memories of long-forgotten diseases. Even today, these ancient fragments help shape how our bodies respond to illness. Some Neanderthal genes strengthen our resistance to certain infections. Others, ironically, make us more prone to allergies or inflammation. The same mechanisms that once saved lives in a harsher world can, in a modern environment, misfire against harmless things like pollen or dust. It is as if the body remembers dangers that no longer exist, fighting shadows of the past. There are subtler influences too. Studies have found traces of Neanderthal DNA involved in sleep cycles, metabolism, and even mood regulation. Some of these genes adjust how the body senses daylight, guiding our internal clock, a vital trait in lands where winter days were dim and short. Others may shape how our bodies store fat or react to cold, quiet remnants of adaptations to frozen steppes and glacial winds. In ways both profound and invisible, their world lives on beneath our skin. The ache in your muscles after a long day, the way your skin flushes under the sun, the rhythm of your sleep, all carry faint signatures of an older form of humanity. It is not heritage in the cultural sense, but inheritance in the truest sense of the word. When scientists sequence the human genome and trace these fragments, what they find is not uniform. Some people carry more Neanderthal ancestry, some less, depending on where their distant ancestors wandered after leaving Africa. Populations in East Asia, for instance, tend to have slightly higher percentages, suggesting multiple waves of contact between the two species. In contrast, people whose ancestry traces most directly to Africa carry little or no Neanderthal DNA, since their forebears never met them. Yet even there, smaller echoes may survive through later migrations and mixing. Humanity, after all, has never been a collection of isolated branches, but a web of crossings and returns. These discoveries remind us that evolution did not end when the last Neanderthal walked the earth. It continues within us, shaped not only by our present, but by the long memory of the past. Every cell in our bodies carries fragments of ancient code, refined by time yet never erased. We are mosaics of lineage, part modern human, part Neanderthal, part the uncounted ancestors who came before them. The more scientists study these inherited traces, the clearer it becomes that the boundary between species was never absolute. It was porous, alive, and human in every sense of the word. Our ancestors did not simply replace the Neanderthals. They met them, learned from them, shared life with them, and carried a part of them forward. Now, tens of thousands of years later, their story still moves quietly within us. It does not show in the curve of a smile or the color of an eye, but it hums beneath the surface, steady as a pulse. It is the echo of survival, of shared endurance, of the unbroken chain that links every human to those who came before. To know that Neanderthal blood flows faintly through us is not a curiosity of science alone. It is a reminder that we are not separate from the long past. We are its continuation. Beneath our skin, in the unseen spirals of our DNA, the past is not lost. It is alive, waiting, always to be remembered. To look for the people who came before us is to search for voices in silence. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the early humans of Ice Age Europe, none of them left written words or carved histories. They vanished long before memory could be passed through language, yet their story did not disappear. It lingers quietly in what remains, a fragment of bone, a scatter of stone flakes, the faint trace of a hearth long turned to ash. Through these remnants, we learn to listen again. Archaeology is the art of patience. It begins with dust, with the slow scraping of a trowel across soil, and the careful brushing away of time. Every layer of earth is a page of a book written in material instead of ink. A broken tool might speak of a hunt. A burned shell might reveal what was eaten beside a fire. A footprint pressed into ancient mud can tell the size of a hand, the weight of a body, the direction of a journey. To reconstruct their world, scientists must work like detectives of deep time. They gather clues from places that once held warmth and sound, caves, riverbanks, and rock shelters, and read them as carefully as a story half erased. A single flint blade can reveal not only the skill of its maker, but also the rhythm of their life. The angles of a cut, the polish of an edge, even the type of stone used can tell where it came from, how it was shaped, and what purpose it served. Sometimes, a few burnt bones tell of a meal shared. In the blackened fragments of mammoth ribs or reindeer bones, scientists find patterns of cutting, scraping, and roasting. They can tell which tools were used, how fires were built, and whether the meat was cooked in haste or carefully prepared. Through isotopic analysis, the chemistry of those bones reveals what these ancient people ate, what seasons they lived through, and even the kind of plants that grew around them. Ash and charcoal carry their own memories. When examined under a microscope, they show what kind of wood was burned, whether the fires were for warmth or cooking, and how long they lasted. In caves that sheltered families for generations, multiple layers of hearths lie stacked one above another, each a small circle of life preserved in stone. They speak of return, of people coming back to the same place year after year, perhaps for safety, perhaps for something like home. The story grows richer when other sciences join the search. Geneticists, geologists, chemists, and anthropologists work together like different senses of the same mind. From ancient DNA extracted from bones and sediments, we learn who these people were, their ancestry, their migrations, their connections to one another. From the minerals around those bones, geologists can tell when glaciers advanced, when rivers shifted, when climates warmed or froze. Even the soil remembers. In recent years, scientists have discovered that the Earth itself can hold fragments of DNA from long-gone creatures. A handful of sediment from a cave floor can contain traces of Neanderthals, bears, wolves, and birds, a molecular record of life once teeming in the same space. Each grain of earth becomes a vessel for memory, preserving what time tried to erase. Anthropologists add another layer, reading the bones for gestures of care and ritual. A healed fracture hints at compassion, for someone must have tended the injured. A body buried with tools or flowers suggests meaning beyond survival, a quiet awareness of death and continuity. When seen together, these clues reveal that the people of the Ice Age were not just survivors, but thinkers and dreamers who felt the world deeply. In this work, science becomes an act of remembrance. Every discovery, no matter how small, is a conversation with those who cannot speak. The scientist in the lab, hunched over a microscope, and the archaeologist in the field, kneeling in the dirt, both share the same purpose: to listen. They trace the outline of vanished lives, not to claim ownership, but to restore their presence in the great unfolding of time. Each discovery carries a kind of intimacy. The grooves on a flint show where a hand once pressed. The smooth surface of a tool handle still bears the faint wear of a thumb that held it centuries before the first city rose. Even the broken things, a snapped spear, a discarded core of stone, have stories to tell. They remind us that imperfection, too, endures. The most powerful moments of reconstruction come not from grandeur, but from simplicity. A child's footprint, found beside a set of adult tracks in a French cave, tells of companionship, of teaching, of movement through a quiet world. A handful of ochre dust beside a hearth speaks of art, of curiosity, of color carried into darkness. From such delicate fragments, entire worlds unfold, not imagined, but remembered through evidence and care. In this way, the study of the ancient past is not only about discovery, but about gratitude, to dig, to test, to piece together the scattered clues of our ancestors is to keep them within the circle of the living. Their tools and bones do not belong to a vanished world alone. They belong to us too, because their story is the foundation of our own. Every flake of stone, every particle of DNA, every soot-stained wall brings us closer to understanding that we are part of a single, continuous story, one that began long before names and will continue long after memory fades. Science, at its heart, is the gentle art of listening to time, and through it, we keep the past alive, not as a shadow, but as a quiet presence walking beside us still. For more than a century, the Neanderthals have lived two lives. One was real, buried beneath stone and time, pieced together by archaeologists and scientists. The other was imagined, a story written not by evidence, but by us. For most of modern history, the Neanderthal was not seen as kin, but as a caricature. The name itself became an insult. To call someone a Neanderthal was to call them brutish, backward, incapable of thought or feeling. This false image began not in caves but in museums and magazines. The first Neanderthal bones were discovered in the mid 19th century, at a time when Europe was still trying to understand evolution and humanity's place in nature. The idea that there had once been other kinds of humans was unsettling. Artists were asked to reconstruct what these beings looked like, and the results were shaped less by evidence than by imagination. They were drawn with sloping foreheads, wild hair, and vacant eyes, half man, half beast. These images stuck. In the early 20th century, the myth grew stronger. Films and books painted the Neanderthal as a creature of violence. He was often shown dragging women by the hair, grunting instead of speaking, living in dark caves without thought beyond hunger and rage. These were not humans, the stories said, but savages destined to be replaced by something higher, by us. Pop culture did not just misunderstand the Neanderthals, it used them as mirrors. Each time society wanted to explore what it meant to be civilized, it held up the Neanderthal as the opposite. In comic strips and advertisements, the caveman became a symbol of ignorance, of the unrefined and uneducated. Even in the most playful depictions, the stone clubs, the furs, the fires, there was always the same message beneath. They were the beginning, and we were the end. But science has a way of dissolving myths, gently, one discovery at a time. The more bones, tools, and DNA fragments we uncover, the clearer it becomes that these so-called primitives were not what the stories made them out to be. The real Neanderthals were hunters, artists, and caregivers. They made tools with precision, built shelters against the cold, and cared for their young and elderly. They adapted to Europe's harsh climate for more than 300,000 years, longer than modern humans have yet existed. Their faces, when reconstructed with care and accuracy, no longer appear monstrous. They are strikingly familiar. Their eyes are deep, intelligent. Their expressions are subtle, capable of warmth and thought. The line between them and us, once drawn in arrogance, has blurred into kinship. The fossil record tells a quieter, truer story. Neanderthal sites reveal order and cooperation, hearths surrounded by tools, food shared among groups, evidence of planning and creativity. The marks on bones show not chaos, but craft. The pigments and beads found near some of their remains suggest decoration and meaning, perhaps even ritual. They spoke through the hands that shaped stone and the fires that kept their families alive. Yet the image of the caveman still lingers. It is easy to reduce ancient life to simplicity. The past feels far away, and distance makes distortion comfortable. In stories and movies, the Ice Age becomes a stage for drama, survival, conflict, discovery, but real life then was not a single story of conquest or brutality. It was slow, patient, and deeply human in its ordinariness. They laughed, they feared, they endured. The danger of oversimplifying the human story lies not just in misrepresenting them, but in misunderstanding ourselves. When we imagine the Neanderthals as less than human, we lose sight of the long, shared journey that shaped us both. We forget that intelligence wears many faces, and that empathy, creativity, and love are older than our own species. Modern reevaluation has begun to correct that view. Museums now show Neanderthals as people, not creatures, clothed, upright, and thoughtful. Scientists describe them not as failures, but as another successful branch of humanity that met an ending shaped by circumstance, not inferiority. The story is not of defeat, but of transformation. They live on within us, in fragments of DNA, in shared instincts, in the deep memory of firelight and family. Still, the myths persist because they are easy to tell. The truth, though, is far richer. The Neanderthals remind us that humanity is not a ladder with rungs of progress, but a tree with many branches, each reaching in its own direction before returning to the same sky. Their disappearance was not the triumph of one species over another, but a quiet blending of stories. Science continues to rewrite their image, but art, too, has begun to listen. In recent years, films, novels, and documentaries have started to portray Neanderthals with empathy and nuance as thinkers, parents, and explorers of their own kind. Slowly, the caveman fades into memory, replaced by something truer and far more beautiful, a fellow human, different yet familiar, looking out at the same world with wondering eyes. The bones we once mocked now speak with quiet dignity. They remind us that the story of humanity is not about dominance, but connection. Beneath the layers of myth and misunderstanding, the Neanderthal still waits, not as a relic of failure, but as a reflection of what it has always meant to be human, fragile, curious, and capable of grace, even in the coldest of worlds. The Ice Age stretched across Europe in silence. Glaciers rose like sleeping giants, and the wind carried the breath of distant storms. In the midst of that frozen stillness, something remarkable took place, a meeting that would change the human story forever. Far from any modern road or city, two groups stood facing one another. One was ancient to the land, shaped by generations of cold and endurance. The other had arrived from warmer horizons, crossing mountains and valleys in search of new ground. They looked almost alike, but not entirely. The same upright form, the same eyes that caught the reflection of firelight, but with small differences that only grew the longer they looked. There were no names for these people yet, no labels of Neanderthal or Homo sapiens, only faces and the air between them, tense, uncertain, alive with recognition. We do not know where it happened first. Perhaps beside a river cutting through frozen plains, or at the edge of a forest where mammoths had passed only hours before. The air might have smelled of smoke and snow. They might have been holding tools, watching one another's movements with cautious intelligence. For a moment, no one spoke, and then something subtle broke the distance, a motion of the hand, a lowering of a weapon, a sound that carried no threat. Across the cold air, they saw themselves reflected. The Neanderthals had known Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. They were the keepers of this continent's memory, shaped by its long winters and short bursts of warmth. The newcomers carried with them the restlessness of travelers, the memory of wide savannas and open skies. Between them, there was both difference and connection, an invisible thread drawn across time. No fossil can capture that moment. No tool, no bone can tell us what they felt. But what we know from science, the DNA mingled in our blood, the traces of shared children, tells us that those moments were real. They did not always end in conflict. There was cooperation, curiosity, and sometimes love. To stand before another intelligent being and know it is not you, that is a rare experience in the history of life. Most animals never face that kind of mirror. For early humans, it must have been overwhelming. Here was another creature who used fire, who planned, who dreamed, yet whose voice and rhythm were foreign. The encounter blurred the boundaries of what it meant to be human. Perhaps the first meeting was brief. A shared carcass in the snow, a hunted deer divided between groups. Perhaps, in the flickering of a fire, They learned that warmth was a language they both understood. Over time, these meetings would happen again and again, scattered across generations. Sometimes they would end in distance, sometimes in kinship, but every encounter carried an echo, a realization that the thinking world was not theirs alone. That awareness must have changed something deep within us. Before this, humanity was singular. Each tribe might have seen itself as the only center of thought. But when our ancestors met the Neanderthals, they discovered another center, another consciousness, separate yet familiar. In that discovery, the first idea of us and them was born, not from hatred, but from wonder. This was the first true mirror of humanity, not made of polished stone or still water, but of another being. The Neanderthals reflected us in ways no animal ever had. Their presence forced our ancestors to see themselves, to notice the shape of their own minds. From that mirror came empathy, the ability to imagine what another might feel or think, and from empathy grew storytelling, memory, and art, the quiet gifts that make our species what it is. There was fear, too, the fear of the unknown, of those who were like us but not quite, fear of scarcity, of losing one's place in a world already harsh. But fear, when survived, becomes understanding. In the cold of Europe, cooperation was often stronger than conflict. A shared hunt, a shared fire, a shared glance across the dark. These were acts of survival that built bridges instead of walls. Imagine for a moment a night deep in the Ice Age. The fire burns low. A human child and a Neanderthal child sit nearby, curious about each other's gestures. Their parents watch quietly, unsure, yet not unkind. The children reach toward the same spark of light, and for a heartbeat, the gap between species disappears. Though time would move on and the Neanderthals would fade, something from those meetings remained in us. Our blood still carries their traces. Our minds still carry their lesson that intelligence is not a crown, but a shared inheritance. We are not the first to think or to dream. We are only the latest to carry that light forward. And so, when we look into a mirror today, the reflection that gazes back is not ours alone. It carries the faint memory of another time when two kinds of humans met and saw themselves multiplied. The curve of the brow, the spark in the eyes, the small, unspoken emotions all whisper that we were never truly alone. Before we mapped the stars or named the constellations, we looked into another pair of eyes and found recognition. And from that moment on, humanity was never the same. Long before words filled the air, before stories were passed around fires, thought already moved quietly within the minds of ancient humans. It was not a sudden gift given to us alone, but something that grew slowly, shared among those who came before. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and their common ancestors all carried pieces of the same spark that would one day shape the world we know. Our minds are not new creations, they are continuations, built layer upon layer through the struggles and small triumphs of lives long forgotten. When we imagine our ancestors, we often picture strength and endurance, but behind those features was something deeper, awareness, a kind of seeing that looked beyond the next meal or the next shelter toward meaning itself. The Neanderthals, for example, were not only survivors of cold and scarcity, they were thinkers. Their brains were as large as ours, in some ways larger, arranged in a slightly different shape, but carrying the same intricate folds of memory, emotion, and reason. The tools they made required planning. The hunts they organized needed cooperation and foresight. Even their care for the sick and the injured reveals something more than instinct. It shows compassion, the quiet understanding that another's suffering matters. Somewhere in that recognition, the roots of humanity deepen. Compassion is a kind of intelligence, one that binds thought to feeling. It is what turns survival into society. When a Neanderthal shared warmth with another, or offered food to a child that was not their own, they were practicing the same emotional logic that holds our families and communities together today. The capacity to care is not ours alone. It has been whispered through generations of minds, shaped by both hardship and hope. Problem solving, too, connected these early humans to us. The stones they struck into sharp edges were not made by accident. The process took patience, rhythm, and memory. Each blow had to follow the last in a precise way, as if guided by a mental pattern that existed long before the hands moved. When researchers study those ancient flakes of flint, they see not just tools but thoughts made visible, the fingerprints of intention. Even in their environment, they adapted with creativity. When ice spread across Europe and game became scarce, Neanderthals shifted their hunting strategies, built shelters, and found new ways to use what the land provided. That flexibility, that ability to imagine something that does not yet exist, is one of the oldest signs of imagination. And then there was art, simple, fragile, yet powerful. Long before Homo sapiens filled caves with animals and shapes, Neanderthals marked walls with red pigment and carved bones with deliberate lines. These were not decorations. They were expressions, gestures toward memory and meaning. To create art is to say, I was here. It is to hold a moment still against time. That impulse to remember, to make beauty out of survival, is something we inherited as surely as the color of our eyes. Memory itself became the bridge between generations. Through memory, knowledge could live longer than a single lifetime. A child could learn how to strike flint from a grandparent, could inherit more than just strength. That passing down of understanding is one of the most human acts there is. But it did not begin with us. It began when minds before ours realized that experience could be shared, that the past could guide the future. When we look at the long story of our evolution, it becomes clear that the boundary between them and us is softer than we once believed. The minds of these ancient people were not primitive. They were different versions of thought, molded by different worlds. The same brain that allowed them to survive the Ice Age also allowed us to build civilizations. The continuity between their cognition and ours is a reminder that the human story is not a ladder of progress, but a web of connections. We often speak of humanity as if it began with modern humans, as if awareness suddenly awakened one morning and never looked back. But the truth is gentler. Our consciousness grew from theirs. Every time they planned a hunt, shared a fire, or dreamed beneath the northern stars, they were shaping the patterns that would one day define us. Even today, when scientists study our brains, they find traces of that inheritance. The regions that allow empathy, creativity, and complex thought have deep evolutionary roots. The architecture of emotion is ancient. The way we solve problems, the way we imagine the unseen, even the way we grieve, these are echoes of a long lineage of minds. It is humbling to think that compassion and imagination are not inventions, but inheritances. We did not create them from nothing. We received them, carried through countless generations of minds that looked out on a dangerous world and still chose to understand it. When you close your eyes and dot, think. When you remember a loved one or imagine something new, you are participating in a story that began hundreds of thousands of years ago. A story told not in words, but in the silent continuity of thought. Humanity was never born in a single moment. It grew in the spaces between lives, in the care given, in the ideas shared, in the dreams that survived the cold. And perhaps that is the greatest truth of all. The human mind was not a spark that appeared once and burned brightly. It was a slow, patient flame, passed from hand to hand, from species to species, until it reached us. It still burns now, not as ours alone, but as the light we inherited from every mind that came before. For most of history, we imagined the story of humanity as a straight line, a clear beginning, a single path, and an inevitable destination that led to us. But science has revealed a very different tale. It is not a line at all, but a tree, a vast, branching family whose roots twist deep into time, connecting species that once walked, thought, and dreamed beneath the same sun. Each new discovery, each fossil lifted gently from the earth, adds another branch to that tree. For every name we already know, Neanderthal, Denisovan, Homo sapiens, there are others waiting in the dust. Some are known from only a handful of bones, others from the fragile whisper of ancient DNA hidden in the soil. Each carries a fragment of our shared inheritance, each one a reminder that we were never alone in our becoming. In recent years, science has begun to read those fragments with extraordinary clarity. The tools of genetics allow us to trace connections across continents and millennia. Tiny sequences of DNA, preserved in tooth enamel or the core of a fossilized bone, tell stories that even stone cannot. Through them, we have learned that Europe's human past is deeply entangled with that of Africa, Asia, and beyond. When geneticists first sequenced Neanderthal DNA, they found something astonishing. Their genes did not vanish when they disappeared. Pieces of them remain alive today, scattered among modern humans, carried quietly through generations. Later, when scientists uncovered the genetic code of the Denisovans, a mysterious group known from only a few bones found in a Siberian cave, the family tree grew wider still. The Denisovans were distant cousins to both Neanderthals and us. Their genetic legacy survives not only in Asia, but also in the Pacific, in places thousands of miles from where their bones were found. High in the Himalayas, certain people still carry genes that help them thrive in thin mountain air, an ancient gift inherited from Denisovan ancestors. In this way, our family's story stretches across the whole planet, written in the code of life itself, and still, the branches continue to multiply. Fossils from Africa reveal new species that complicate the once simple picture. Some, like Homo naledi, had small brains but surprisingly human-like hands. Others, like Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits of Indonesia, were tiny, isolated, and unique, yet capable of crafting tools. These discoveries remind us that humanity was never a single line of progress. It was a mosaic of possibilities, each one shaped by its own landscape and time. Every new find reshapes the idea of what it means to be human. Once, we believed intelligence belonged only to us. Then we learned that Neanderthals made art, cared for their dead, and perhaps spoke in words. We thought compassion was our invention, until we found fossils showing healed bones, proof of lives cared for by others. We thought imagination belonged to modern minds, until pigments and carvings showed that ancient hands had already begun to dream. The more we uncover, the more humility the story demands. The human family is not a tale of conquest or perfection. It is a story of coexistence and transformation, of species rising, meeting, and blending, only to fade into new forms. Our ancestors did not walk toward us as a goal. They simply lived, adapted, and loved in the ways the world allowed them to. We are only one outcome among many. To rediscover our family is to rediscover our place in nature. The genes that shape our bodies were not written solely for us. They were gathered over millions of years, from lives both familiar and strange. When we breathe, when we feel wonder, when we build or imagine, we are drawing upon that ancient inheritance. The boundary between past and present is thin, thinner than we ever knew. Even the soil beneath our feet holds traces of those who came before. Scientists have learned to extract DNA not just from bones, but from the earth itself. In the sediments of caves, they find the invisible remains of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and early humans who once rested there. The ground remembers what we have forgotten. In its silence, it keeps the echoes of laughter, firelight, and voices long gone. Each discovery deepens the mystery rather than closing it. The more we learn, the more we see how fragile and interconnected life truly is. Evolution is not a march of progress, but a dance, a rhythm of divergence and reunion, of endings and continuations. For every species that vanished, something remained, folded into the future. And so, when we trace our lineage backward through time, we find no clear beginning. We find a chorus, a thousand lives converging, branching, and rejoining, each contributing something small but essential: strength from one, imagination from another, adaptability from many. In this way, humanity is not an invention, but a composition, the sum of countless lives, written across continents, shaped by both struggle and grace. Every fossil, every strand of ancient DNA reminds us that we are not the culmination of the story, only a chapter. The book of life did not end with us. It continues in every living thing that still adapts and dreams. We are not its authors, but its inheritors, caretakers of a tale that began long before we arrived and will go on long after we are gone. There is a kind of silence that only deep time can hold. It lingers beneath mountains, in the breath of wind that crosses forgotten plains, in the places where rivers once curved through ice and stone. That silence is not empty. It carries the memory of every voice that once spoke beneath the same sky, voices of humans who are gone, yet not truly lost. When we look back now, across hundreds of thousands of years, we do not see strangers. We see fragments of ourselves scattered through time: Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others whose names we may never know. All of them are part of the long story that shaped what we are. Their lives did not end in isolation. They live quietly within us, not only in the strands of DNA that still echo their code, but in the very ways we think, create, and care. Every breath we take, every spark of thought that drifts through the mind, carries the faint inheritance of those who came before. We are their continuation, the bridge that connects the ancient world to the present one. The shape of our hands, the depth of our emotions, the curve of our imagination, all are mosaics built from their survival. They endured so that we could exist. In the quiet corners of our biology, traces of them still hum like an old song. Genes that help us fight disease, adapt to climate, or even shape our skin and hair, these are the fingerprints of people who vanished long ago. Yet their influence extends beyond biology. It lives in our empathy, in our urge to protect, to remember, to wonder. Those are ancient instincts, passed through generations of minds that looked at firelight and saw meaning. When the Neanderthals disappeared, the world did not simply grow emptier. Something of them remained behind, mingled into us. Their knowledge of cold winters, their rhythm of patience, their quiet resilience, these qualities folded into the story of humanity. In their absence, the earth changed, but not entirely. Their echoes became part of our own voices, guiding us gently through the ages that followed. We often imagine evolution as a ladder, with each rung replacing the last. But the truth is softer. It is more like a web, each life touching others, overlapping, leaving traces that never truly fade. Extinction is not absolute erasure, it is transformation. The other humans did not vanish into nothingness. They were absorbed into the continuing pattern of life, their legacy diffused into every cell that makes us human. When scientists study ancient genomes, they are not merely reading data, they are listening to whispers from the deep past. Each sequence of code is a message of endurance, a record of love, struggle, and adaptation. The more we learn, the clearer it becomes that survival was never a solitary achievement. Humanity did not stand alone at the dawn of its existence. We were always part of a wider chorus, a family of minds spread across continents and time. To walk this earth today is to carry that family with us. We are not the peak of a mountain, but a river, one that flows through everything that came before, gathering what it needs to continue. Every act of kindness, every question asked, every story told by firelight is a continuation of that current. The ice age is long gone, its glaciers melted, its great beasts vanished into legend. Yet the memory of that world endures in us. The patience of those who endured the cold is still written in our resilience. The curiosity of those who gazed into the night sky is still present in our search for knowledge. The compassion that bound small groups together beneath harsh winters still guides the way we reach for one another. We are not separate from the other humans who once walked beside us. We are their echo, shaped by their triumphs and their losses. To meet them in fossils, in art, in the faint codes of our DNA is not to mourn them, but to remember that their story continues through us. They did not vanish. They became part of the living world that still breathes and thinks and dreams. In the stillness of reflection, gratitude begins to rise. Gratitude for every ancestor who built fires in the dark, who protected the young, who shaped stone into purpose. Gratitude for every mind that wondered what lay beyond the horizon. They made the path, even if they never knew where it would lead. And as we stand now, surrounded by the lights of our own making, it is worth remembering that we are not the ending of their story, only its latest chapter. The earth will continue to turn long after us, carrying new forms of life, new thinkers, new caretakers of memory. To meet the other humans of our past is to be reminded of this shared continuity that life endures by connection, not by dominance. We survived, but we never truly stood alone. When you trace your hand across the smooth surface of a stone or look up at the same stars they once saw, you are touching the same thread that binds all of humanity together. The thread stretches backward, through time, into the hands of those who dreamed before language, and forward into futures we will never see. Their story ends only when we forget to listen, but if we pause, if we breathe and remember, we can still hear them in our hearts, in our blood, in the quiet hum of thought. We are the living bridge to every human who came before. And one day, others will stand where we stand now, feeling the same gratitude, whispering the same truth, that we, too, were only visitors in the story of Earth.